Every great game carries something beneath its surface, a layer of quiet detail that most players never quite reach, hidden not in locked rooms or secret passages, but in the spaces between what is shown and what was always there. Pokémon has always been a world like this, a world where the smallest choices, a name, a color, a sound, a number, carry meanings that stretch far beyond the moment you first encounter them. The games have always rewarded those who look carefully, who notice the way light falls differently depending on the time of day, who wonder why certain Pokémon only appear under certain skies. And before you drift any further, please consider subscribing to join the Cozy Club for more videos like this, and tell me where you're watching from tonight. There is a particular kind of knowledge that belongs only to Pokémon. It is not the knowledge of strategies, or movesets, or battle mathematics, though those things have their own deep complexity. It is the knowledge of meaning, of the ideas embedded in creatures and places that seem simple at first glance, but reveal themselves slowly, like shapes forming in the dark, as your eyes adjust. These are the hidden things, the things that reward patience and attention, the things that make the world of Pokémon feel less like a game and more like a place that was always waiting to be understood. The Pokémon world is built on a foundation of careful intention. Every region has a logic to it, a set of ideas and themes that shape the creatures you find, the towns you pass through, the music that plays as you walk beneath trees or stand at the edge of a cliff overlooking the sea. These intentions are not always announced. They do not hold up signs explaining what they mean. They simply exist quietly for those who take the time to look. One of the most enduring hidden structures in the Pokémon series is the way regions are named. In the earliest games, the towns and cities of Kanto were named after colors: palette, pewter, cerulean, vermilion, lavender, celadon, fuchsia, saffron, cinnabar. These were not arbitrary choices. A color carries meaning, and the designers understood that a journey through color is also a journey through emotion. Palette Town, the beginning, is named for a painter's palette, the empty surface on which all colors are about to be mixed. It is the moment before anything has been decided. It is the breath before the first word. What is remarkable about this color structure is how it extends across the boundary between games. The first town you ever encounter in the combined Kanto and Johto experience is Palette Town, whose name in Japanese carries the meaning of white. In the final city you reach in Johto, after crossing mountains and rivers and seas, is Blackthorn City, whose name suggests the darkest shade. You begin in white, the color that contains no hue but holds the potential of all of them, and you end in black, which absorbs everything that came before. In between, a long procession of colors, of places and people and moments, all of it leading from one end of the spectrum to the other. Whether this was intentional or an elegant accident is a question that may never have a definitive answer, but the structure is there regardless, waiting to be noticed, like a pattern in the grain of old wood. The Johto region carried another hidden theme, even more pervasive than its colors: time. The cycle of day and night arrived with gold and silver, and the designers embedded it so deeply into the fabric of the region that it became almost invisible. Some connections were obvious. Espeon evolved during the day. Umbreon emerged at night. These were clear signals of the theme, but the subtler ones were scattered everywhere, like stones placed along a path that only becomes clear when you reach its end. Cleffa and Igglybuff were children of moonlight, requiring a moonstone to grow into their adult forms. Blossom and Sunflora reached their full expression with the help of a sunstone, creatures that turned toward warmth and brightness. Spinarak appeared only after dark, a night hunter belonging to shadow. Lediba came out in the morning, cheerful and luminous. Miltank, in Pokémon Crystal, could only be found during the morning and day, which makes a quiet kind of sense for a creature whose entire existence is bound up in the rhythm of farming and early light. Celebi, the mythical creature at the heart of the region, existed outside of time entirely, traveling between past and future the way a dreamer moves between sleeping and waking. The theme of time in Johto was never announced. It simply was, woven into the world the way seasons are woven into a landscape. You could spend years playing those games and never quite articulate what you were experiencing, but you felt it. The world knew what hour it was. The world was always aware of where the sun had gone. There is something deeply restful about a world that keeps its own time, about a game that changes as the hours pass, that offers different things to those who play in the morning and those who play after midnight. Pokémon was one of the first games to do this, to align itself with the actual rhythm of a player's day, and the effect was something that felt almost magical. You were not just playing a game, you were living inside it, at least a little. As we drift a little deeper into this topic, it is worth pausing on the way hidden things in Pokémon often reveal themselves through language. Names carry enormous weight in these games. A name can tell you what a Pokémon is before you ever see its design, if you know how to read it. And reading Pokémon names is its own quiet art. Ghastly, Haunter, and Gengar form a chain of escalating dread, each name a little heavier than the last. Ghastly suggests something gaseous and insubstantial, a wisp of wrongness in a dark corridor. Haunter is already more active, more intentional, a thing that pursues. Gengar is the heaviest of the three, and its name in Japanese Gangar echoes a word for nightmare. The evolution from ghost to haunter to nightmare is embedded in the syllables themselves. Slowpoke, Slowbro, and Slowking tell a different kind of story. Slowpoke is gentle and unhurried, a creature whose entire identity is built around a comfortable relationship with the passage of time. Slowbro adds something unexpected, a creature that should perhaps be disturbed by the shelter clamped to its tail, but which responds to this intrusion with the same quiet serenity it brings to everything. Slowking takes that serenity and elevates it into wisdom, and the name suggests that the slowness was never a limitation. It was always a different kind of knowing. Pokémon names in Japanese often reveal layers that do not survive translation. Fushigidan, the Japanese name of Bulbasaur, combines the words for strange and seed, which is more precise than the English name, and speaks directly to the quiet strangeness of a creature that carries a plant on its back. Hitokage, Charmander's Japanese name, means something close to fire lizard, which is accurate but also carries a warmth in its sound that the English name replaces with something charmingly invented. Neither translation is wrong. They are simply two different doors into the same room. The names of legendary Pokémon often carry the heaviest weight. Lugia, who watches over the sea, has a name that suggests both luminosity and the Spanish word for moon. Lugia belongs to water and sky, to the surface where light meets depth, and the name holds that duality quietly. Ho-Oh, who watches over the land, has a name that echoes the Japanese word for phoenix, but its call in the games, a long sweeping sound, suggests something even older, something from before language had fully arrived. The hidden language of Pokémon extends beyond names into the very shapes of things. The silhouette of a Pokémon is a kind of sentence. You can recognize most Pokémon, even in complete shadow, because their outlines carry their identity. Pikachu's jagged tail, Gengar's broad grin even when the rest of the form disappears into darkness. Lapras's long neck rising from the water like a dream of something ancient. These shapes were not accidental. They were designed to be remembered, to survive compression and shadow and small screens, to be legible even at the edge of perception. Magikarp has perhaps the most famous silhouette in the series, though its fame comes partly from what it conceals. The helpless flopping fish that becomes Gyarados is one of the oldest stories Pokemon tells, and it is also one of the most enduring because it speaks to something genuinely true. The creature that seems weakest sometimes contains the largest transformation. The thing you dismiss today may become the thing you cannot ignore tomorrow. Magikarp knows this and reveals nothing. There is a particular silence in the Magikarp line that belongs to the idea of hidden potential. The game gives you this creature that cannot do anything useful for a long time, that splashes and struggles and seems to offer nothing. But it asks you to wait. And if you wait, if you carry this useless thing through enough battles and enough days, what emerges from it will take your breath away. Gyarados is enormous and wrathful and absolutely real in a way that Magikarp somehow was not. It earned its existence. This structure of waiting and transformation runs through the entire Pokémon series, like a river beneath the surface. It is one of its deepest hidden truths. Evolution in Pokémon is not just a game mechanic, it is a philosophy. It says that what you are right now is not what you will always be. It says that change is not just possible, but inevitable if you persist through enough moments. Fossil Pokémon were one of the earliest expressions of this. The idea that creatures from an unimaginably distant past could be brought back, given new life, asked to exist in a world they never belonged to, is genuinely haunting when you sit with it. Aerodactyl roaming the skies of Kanto, a sky it last inhabited millions of years ago. Kabuto and Omanite, creatures of an ancient sea, blinking in a world of electric gems and pocket-sized devices. The Pokédex entries for fossil Pokémon sometimes acknowledge this displacement. Aerodactyl's entries speak of its ferocity, of a creature designed to dominate a world that no longer exists. Omastar's entries describe a creature that became extinct, not through catastrophe but through evolution, outpaced by its own future. These small notes in the Pokédex are some of the most philosophically rich writing in the series, and they are easy to miss because they appear in 2 or 3 sentences, and the game immediately wants you to move on to the next route. Pokédex entries deserve their own quiet attention. They are perhaps the most underread text in any game. Players see them once, or maybe twice, and then they are filed away in a digital encyclopedia that most trainers never open again after childhood. But the entries accumulate into something extraordinary if you read them together. They describe a world far stranger and more dangerous than the one the game's present on the surface. Haunter's entry tells you that touching it will cause your body to shake uncontrollably until you perish. Gengar's entry tells you that it lurks in rooms on cold nights, dropping the temperature by 10 degrees and grinning when it sees shivering. Hypno's entry warns that it has been known to abduct children who make eye contact with its pendulum. These are not the entries of creatures that belong in a gentle adventure. They are glimpses of something much older and stranger, a world where the boundary between the ordinary and the terrifying is very thin, but Pokémon has always carried this duality. It is a world of warmth and friendship and the particular joy of a creature that trusts you completely, and it is also a world where darkness has its own logic and its own deep roots. The two coexist without contradiction because the world itself is big enough to hold both. Just as the real world contains both quiet mornings and frightening nights, the Pokémon world contains both Clefairy dancing in the moonlight and Gengar waiting in the corners of cold rooms. The music of the Pokémon world carries its own hidden layers. Composing music for these games has always been an act of extraordinary restraint and precision. The hardware limitations of the earliest games meant that composers worked with a very small number of simultaneous tones, and the melodies they created within those constraints are among the most enduring in all of gaming. Route 1 in Kanto is one of the most recognizable pieces of music ever written for a video game, and it was composed with almost nothing to work with. Its simplicity is its genius. What the early composers understood is that a melody heard in the context of discovery feels different from a melody heard in any other context. You are 8 years old. You have just walked out of your house for the first time as a trainer. The tall grass rustles. A Pidgey flies across the sky. And then the music begins. Route 1's theme is not a complex piece of music, but it does not need to be, because it is meeting you at the exact moment when everything feels possible. The music of the Pokémon world is also deeply tied to place. Lavender Town's music is one of the most discussed in gaming history, not because of its technical complexity, but because of what it does to the air around it. It is not comfortable music. It is music that belongs to a place where things have ended, where the question of what happens to something after it stops existing has been given a physical address. The Pokémon Tower in Lavender Town is the first place in the games where you encounter the concept of death directly, not through implication, but through the presence of graves and mourning and a ghost that cannot leave. The revised versions of Lavender Town's theme, while less aggressively unsettling, still carry a solemnity that is entirely appropriate. There is a long tradition of music for the dead in almost every culture, and Lavender Town participates in that tradition in its own quiet way. It is saying that even in a world of adventure and exploration, some things deserve to be mourned. If you listen carefully to the music of Ecruteak City in Johto, you will hear something that exists between nostalgia and loss. Ecruteak is the oldest city in Johto, a place where the past is not history, but presence, where the burned tower still stands as a reminder of a fire no one has entirely explained, where the kimono girls perform dances that have been passed down through more generations than anyone can count. The music there sounds like memory, which is perhaps the most accurate way to describe something that belongs equally to the past and the present. The ruins of Alf, also in Johto, carry their own kind of hidden music. The main theme of those ruins, with its echoing quality and its sense of vast empty space, is one of the most atmospheric pieces the series has produced. Unown live there, creatures that resemble letters of an alphabet, but communicate nothing legible to ordinary trainers. The ruins contain puzzles, but the puzzles do not explain the unknown. They simply reveal more of them. The mystery deepens without ever arriving at an answer, which is exactly the right way to handle something that should feel genuinely ancient and genuinely strange. Kanto and Johto are the most famous example of connected geography. The two regions share a border, and the games allow you to cross from one to the other, which was extraordinary at the time and remains extraordinary in retrospect. But the connection goes deeper than physical adjacency. The cultures of the two regions are different in ways that the games only partially articulate. Johto is older, more traditional, more connected to ceremony and ritual. Kanto is more modern, more industrial, more interested in the machinery of progress. Standing at the border between them, you are standing between two different ideas about how to live. Hoenn's geography is perhaps the most ambitious in the series. The region is overwhelmingly water, with routes that cross open sea and cities built on islands that feel genuinely isolated from the mainland. The density of water routes in Hoenn was sometimes criticized for slowing down exploration, but it also created something rare in the series, a genuine sense of distance. When you cross the open water between islands, you feel how far you have come from dry land. The world is very large and you are small in it, and the ocean does not care about either of those things. The underwater areas of Hoenn diving locations, accessible only through the HM dive, were one of the series' most unexpected revelations. To descend beneath the surface of the water and find another world beneath the one you thought you understood, a world of silent corridors and ancient ruins and creatures that had adapted to a life without light, was to discover that even the places you thought you knew completely contained more than you had imagined. The seafloor cavern, deep beneath the ocean, hiding the entrance to the cave where the world's most dangerous creatures slept, was reached through this underwater world. The route to power was through depth. The sky pillar in Hoenn, accessible only by crossing a crumbling ancient structure high above everything else, was another kind of hidden geography. Rayquaza lived there, a creature of the upper atmosphere, a dragon that belonged to the zone between weather and space. To reach it, you had to ascend past the ordinary world, past the clouds, past the places where ordinary creatures live, until you arrived at something that had been waiting quietly for someone to climb high enough to find it. The Pokémon world has always used its geography to suggest things about the creatures that live there. Creatures of the mountains carry a different quality than creatures of the ocean. Creatures of the deep forest feel different from creatures of the open plains. This is not just visual design, though the visual design participates. It is something embedded in the way the world has been arranged, so that where you find a Pokémon tells you something about what that Pokémon is. Absol lives in mountainous regions, far from human settlements, appearing only when disaster is near. This behavioral detail, embedded in the Pokédex, transforms Absol from a frightening creature into a tragic one. It does not cause disaster. It senses it and comes to warn, and is misunderstood for its warning. The places where Absol lives, remote and windswept and empty, mirror the loneliness of a creature that has always been feared for something it cannot help. Mew is said to live in Guyana, in South America, which is a specific, and unexpected piece of information buried in the English Pokédex. It suggests that Mew belongs to the real world, or at least to a version of it. The idea that the ancestor of all Pokémon exists somewhere in an actual South American forest, invisible to ordinary observation, but genuinely present, is one of the strangest and most wonderful things the series has ever suggested quietly. There is a tradition in Pokémon of hiding things in plain sight, of placing extraordinary information in locations so ordinary that most players pass them by without stopping. The old man who can be found in various locations across the games, sometimes hinting at secrets that seem like idle chatter, sometimes providing information that changes everything you thought you understood about the region. The girl in the middle of a crowded city who says something that does not quite make sense until you have seen something else, somewhere else, that suddenly makes her words resonate. These scattered pieces of hidden narrative are not required to complete the game. You can become champion without ever speaking to the NPC who reveals the most haunting detail about the region's history. You can catch every Pokémon in the Pokédex without ever reading the Pokédex entry that contains the strangest truth about the creature you just caught. The game offers these things freely and without pressure, which makes discovering them feel like genuine discovery, like finding something that no one told you to look for. It is a world in which every creature is potentially a companion. Not just domesticated animals, not just pets, but creatures of enormous power and intelligence who choose to travel alongside human partners. The relationship between trainer and Pokémon is one of the most examined themes in all the games and anime and films, and it continues to yield new angles the more carefully you look at it. The starter Pokémon tradition is one expression of this relationship. At the beginning of every journey, a young trainer is offered a choice of 3 creatures, one aligned with fire, one with water, one with grass. This choice is the first meaningful decision of the game, and it shapes everything that follows. But what is often not discussed is what the act of choosing means. The starter is not assigned. It is not captured in the wild. It is given freely, with the expectation that this creature and this trainer will become something together that neither could be alone. The way starter Pokémon develop across the generations reveals a great deal about the values each generation wanted to emphasize. Kanto's starters were elemental and almost mythological in their simplicity. Bulbasaur was a seed. Charmander was a flame with a tail. Squirtle was a turtle, carrying its home wherever it went. They were archetypes, clear and direct, statements of what a Pokémon could be. Johto's starters were more culturally specific. Chikorita was named for a plant, Cyndaquil for something small and flickering, Totodile for a crocodile that could not quite take itself seriously. Their final evolutions told more complex stories. Meganium was a creature of quiet dignity. Typhlosion was pure force barely contained. Feraligatr was all open water and power. The starters of Johto felt like they had been through something. Hoenn's starters introduced a sharpness that the earlier generations had avoided. Trieko was angular and watchful. Torchic was small and sweet, but with a heat in its belly that its appearance did not announce. Mudkip had a broad face and a kind of groundedness, a creature that belonged to the earth and water equally. Their final evolutions were more dramatic than any that had come before. Sceptile was a living blade. Blaziken introduced fighting into the fire tradition for the first time, turning the classic fire starter into something that stood upright and moved in the kind of angular way that spoke of training and intention. Swampert was simply enormous, a creature that looked like it could reshape a landscape if it decided to try. The hidden truth about starters is that they are already chosen by the time you make your choice. The game presents the decision as open, as free, as entirely yours. But the design team has already shaped each starter to appeal to different kinds of trainers, and most players feel a connection to one that seems almost immediate. The choice reveals something about who you are, or at least who you understand yourself to be in this moment. Grass suggests patience and care. Fire suggests ambition and heat. Water suggests adaptability and depth. These are not rigid categories, but they are real ones, and the fact that people still remember and argue about their starter Pokémon decades later suggests that the choice carries more weight than a simple game mechanic should. Type systems contain their own hidden architecture worth examining slowly. The original 15 types of the first generation were arranged in relationships of strength and weakness that encoded a kind of elemental philosophy. Water defeats fire, fire defeats grass, grass defeats water. This triangle is ancient, appearing in various forms across many cultures, and its presence at the heart of Pokémon's battle system gives the game a foundation that feels genuinely wise. But the type system is far more complex than that central triangle. Psychic was extraordinarily powerful in the first generation because its weaknesses were largely theoretical. Bug types barely existed in any effective form, and the ghost types that should have countered Psychic were actually defeated by it due to a programming error. This accident of design created a metagame in the first generation that looked nothing like the balanced system the designers had intended, and it gave psychic Pokémon like Alakazam and Starmie and Jinx a dominance they would never quite recapture. The introduction of Dark and Steel types in Gold and Silver was partly a response to this imbalance. Dark types were immune to Psychic, which was an elegant solution. The things that operate in shadow are not subject to the powers of the mind. Steel types were given an extraordinary number of resistances, making them the most defensively versatile type in the game, a shift in the meta that continues to shape competitive play to this day. The Fairy type, introduced in Pokémon X and Y, was another rebalancing, this time addressing the dominance of Dragon types. Before Fairy's introduction, Dragon was resisted only by itself and by steel, which made dragon type moves almost universally effective. The addition of a type that was immune to dragon and dealt super effective damage in return was a quiet revolution. It changed what the endgame looked like without breaking anything that had come before. These hidden patterns of type balance are rarely discussed in terms of the philosophy they embody, but there is a genuine idea at work in each of these decisions. The world changes, new relationships emerge. What was dominant may become vulnerable. What seemed weak may carry a strength that was not immediately legible. The type system is, in this reading, a slow record of a world in balance, always adjusting, always finding new equilibrium. Porygon is a Pokémon made entirely of code. It was the first artificially created Pokémon, built from computer programs in a world that also contains living creatures of extraordinary power and complexity. The existence of Porygon raises a question that the games never quite answer. What is the relationship between natural life and created life in this world? Porygon is recognized as a Pokémon, entered in the Pokédex, treated the same as Pikachu or Charizard. Its artificial origin does not make it less real or less worthy of companionship. The games accept it without ceremony, which is perhaps the most interesting thing about it. Porygon's evolution into Porygon 2 and then Porygon Z tells a more troubled story. Porygon 2 was an improvement, an upgrade that resolved some of the original's technical limitations. Porygon Z was something stranger, an enhancement that went wrong, a creature modified with unauthorized software that made it erratic and unpredictable, and somehow even more endearing for that flaw. The idea of a digital creature that has been made strange by someone tinkering with its code, that carries the results of human ambition applied recklessly, is a genuinely compelling design for something that could have been just a novelty. Mewtwo is perhaps the most philosophically dense Pokémon in the entire series. It was created, like Porygon, by human hands, but it was created through a different process entirely, through the manipulation of ancient biological material and genetic experimentation. Its origin is suffering. It came into existence through the pain of many failed attempts, through a process that did not ask its permission, that used it as a means to an end before it even understood that it existed. The way Mewtwo responds to this origin is one of the most examined aspects of its character. In various media, it has moved between fury and acceptance, between isolation and connection, between the desire to destroy those who made it and a complicated understanding that the circumstances of one's origin do not determine the totality of one's existence. These are not small ideas. They are the kinds of ideas that entire philosophical traditions have wrestled with, and Pokémon placed them inside a fictional creature and asked children to sit with them. Mew, the creature from which Mewtwo was cloned, represents the opposite of this heaviness. Mew is pure curiosity and play, a creature that contains the genetic material of every Pokémon, yet is somehow unburdened by that enormity. It floats. It investigates things. It is invisible to ordinary observation, but not because it is hiding in any hostile sense, simply because it exists at a frequency that ordinary observation cannot quite reach. Mew is the world's original secret, the thing that was always there before anything else, and its lightness in the face of that responsibility is one of the most quietly radical things Pokémon has ever done. Ditto shares something with Mewtwo that has always attracted speculation. Its Pokédex entries mention that it can transform into anything it sees, that its transformation is imperfect only when it tries to reproduce a face. This imperfection of faces is a strangely specific limitation, and it has led many to wonder what Ditto is attempting when it transforms, what is happening inside it, whether it is experiencing something that could be called identity or just executing a process. The entries also mention that when two Ditto meet, They spend time staring at each other, both trying to transform into the other, which creates an infinite regress that the game does not explain, and which feels exactly right for a creature whose entire existence is built on becoming something else. The breeding mechanics of Pokémon, which involve placing two compatible Pokémon together and finding an egg, have always been managed by Ditto's presence in every game. Ditto can breed with almost any Pokémon, taking the role of whichever gender is needed. This makes it the most important creature in the practical architecture of the game's breeding system, and it does so quietly, without fanfare, simply by being what it is. The question of what Ditto is becoming in each encounter, what it understands about the process, sits at the edge of the games without ever being directly addressed. The Eevee line is one of the most deliberately constructed examples of hidden thematic depth in the series. Eevee itself is a creature of possibility, a normal type with an unusually unstable genetic structure that makes it capable of evolving in multiple directions, depending on the conditions of its environment and its relationship with its trainer. This is not just a game mechanic explanation. It is a statement about the nature of identity and the role of relationship in shaping who a creature becomes. Vaporeon is what Eevee becomes when it is immersed in water, when it learns to inhabit a different element entirely and adapt itself to something that is not what it started from. Jolteon is the Eevee that has learned to carry electricity, to let the energy of the world pass through it, rather than trying to resist it. Flareon carries fire, which sounds straightforward, but fire requires fuel, and it requires oxygen, and it requires the constant willingness to continue burning. Espeon and Umbreon, the evolutions introduced in Johto, are the most thematically charged of the early group. Espeon evolves through a relationship of trust built in daylight, through the genuine connection between trainer and Pokémon maintained across time. Umbreon evolves through a relationship of trust built in darkness, through the same connection carried through the hours when nothing is clearly visible. Both require the same foundation, but they become entirely different creatures, depending on the context in which that foundation is tested. The light and the dark do not determine which Eevee is better. They simply determine which Eevee becomes which. Leafeon and Glaceon, the 4th generation editions, are elemental in a different sense. Leafeon evolves near moss-covered rocks in ancient forests. Glaceon evolves near ice-covered rocks in frozen landscapes. The environment has not just influenced them, it has shaped their entire nature. They are their habitat. They have become what they lived near. Sylveon, the newest Eevee evolution, evolves through affection, through the accumulation of moments in which the trainer and the Pokémon have cared for each other. It is a fairy type, and it is perhaps the most direct statement the Eevee line has ever made. Some transformations come not from what surrounds you, but from what you feel. Some of the most significant evolutions are invisible until they are complete. The legendary birds of Kanto, Articuno, Zapdos, and Moltres were positioned in locations that required genuine effort to reach. Articuno lived in the deepest part of the Seafoam Islands, a maze of water and ice that few trainers bothered to navigate completely. Zapdos lived in the power plant, a building on the eastern edge of Kanto that had been abandoned and left to ruin, still humming with residual electricity that belonged to the creature waiting inside. Moltres lived on Victory Road, the path that led toward the Elite Four, which meant that encountering it required being close enough to the end of the journey that most trainers were perhaps too focused on what lay ahead to notice what they were walking past. These placements were not accidental. The legendary birds were powerful creatures that required difficult roads to reach, not because the game wanted to gatekeep them, but because the difficulty of the journey was part of the encounter. You arrived at Articuno having navigated darkness and cold water. You arrived at Zapdos having entered a place that hummed with something enormous and dangerous. You arrived at Moltres already battle-worn and moving towards something even more demanding. The encounters were shaped by the journey that preceded them. The legendary beasts of Johto, Raikou, Entei, and Suicune embodied a completely different approach. They roamed. You could not plan to encounter them. You could not chart a path toward them. You could run across them anywhere in the wild, and when you did, they were likely to flee before you could do much about it. The encounter with a roaming legendary was an encounter with something ungoverned, something that did not want to be caught, but existed in the same world as you, moving through it by its own logic. Suicune, the most narratively significant of the three in Pokémon Crystal, moved across Johto in a pattern that the player had to learn to understand. Meeting it was not random. It required observation, patience, and a willingness to move through the world in a particular way. Crystal treated Suicune as something more than a powerful creature. It treated it as a presence, something whose attention had to be earned before an encounter was possible. The legendary trio associated with Hoenn, Regirock, Regis, and Registeel were perhaps the most deliberately obscure legendary Pokémon in the series. Finding them required interpreting Braille inscriptions on cave walls, reading a language that the game never explained, and which required either patient deciphering or outside information. The three golems waited in chambers that could only be opened by those who had already decoded the instructions of their creator. And their creator, Regigigas, was even more deeply hidden, sleeping in a temple accessible only to those who had already caught the three. The Regi line suggests something about Pokémon legends that is easy to overlook. Some secrets are not just hidden, but layered. Finding the first layer does not reveal everything. It reveals that another layer exists. The knowledge that there is more to find is itself a kind of treasure. The Sinnoh legends carried perhaps the most explicitly mythological weight in the series. Dialga, who controlled time, Palkia, who controlled space, Giratina, who controlled antimatter and existed in a realm parallel to and beneath ordinary existence. These three were presented as the forces underlying reality itself, which was an extraordinary thing to put in a game aimed primarily at children. The implication was that somewhere beyond the roots and gyms and Pokémon centers, the fundamental architecture of existence was maintained by three enormous creatures who had been there longer than anything else. Arceus, the Pokémon introduced at the summit of Sinnoh's mythology, was presented as the creator of all things. Its Pokédex entry stated simply that it hatched from an egg before anything else existed, which is a creation myth compressed into a single sentence. The design of Arceus, a creature that appears almost blank and geometrical in comparison to the elaborate forms of other legendaries, suggests that something before everything would have to be something that contained everything in potential without yet expressing any of it specifically. The Azure Flute, an item that was programmed into Diamond and Pearl but never officially distributed, would have allowed access to the Hall of Origin where Arceus waited. The item existed in the code of the game for years before any player was supposed to see it. The encounter with Arceus was prepared, tested, sitting in the world, but the door to it was never officially opened. This is one of the most poignant details in the series. The creator of the Pokémon world, the origin of everything, was there the whole time, waiting to be found by anyone who knew where to look, but the key was never given. The way the Pokémon world handles seasons is one of these accumulating details. In earlier games, seasons were implicit, suggested by the day-night cycle and the availability of certain Pokémon. In Pokémon Black and White, seasons became explicit. The world changed its appearance with the months. Winter covered certain areas in snow, opening paths across frozen surfaces that were inaccessible in other seasons. Spring brought flowers to locations that were bare in winter. Summer deepened the greens and quickened the rhythms of roots. Autumn turned certain areas amber and amber red, and some areas only yielded certain berries when the fall light was just right. This seasonal architecture was more than aesthetic. It changed what was possible. A Pokémon available in winter might not appear in summer. An area accessible in autumn might be flooded in spring. The world had rhythms that players were expected to learn, to move with, rather than against. It was a game about being in a particular place at a particular time, and the seasons made time itself feel meaningful in a way that the day-night cycle alone could not quite accomplish. The Pokémon world's relationship with weather was explored most directly in the Delta episode of Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, and in the original Ruby and Sapphire's climax. Gruden and Kyogre, the Pokémon said to have created land and ocean respectively, were the focal creatures of a conflict that threatened to tear Hoenn apart. Their awakening triggered a primal weather response. Groudon's presence evaporated the rain and turned the sky into brilliant, burning sunlight. Kyogre's presence drowned the land in a downpour that belonged to the primordial ocean. The weather of the Pokémon world was not just a battle mechanic in this moment. It was a representation of what happens when forces of that magnitude come into conflict. The ordinary world becomes unlivable, the weather becomes impossible, and only something that exists outside of both the sun and the sea, something that belongs to the sky between them, could bring the conflict to an end. Rayquaza, descending from the stratosphere, was not just a powerful creature. It was the resolution to an ancient argument, the third term in an equation that had threatened to become unsolvable. The hidden truths of Pokémon-type matchups extend into storytelling in ways that are rarely acknowledged. Ghost cannot affect Normal. Normal cannot affect Ghost. These two types exist in a kind of mutual impermeability, each invisible to the other's power. This is not just a balance choice. It is a philosophical statement about the relationship between the ordinary and the supernatural. The normal world and the world of spirits do not destroy each other. They simply pass through each other, unable to make contact, each real only within its own framework. Fighting cannot affect Ghost either, which is a different kind of statement. Force and will and physical effort are not the tools with which you navigate the territory of spirits. That territory requires different tools entirely, the tools of the darkness itself, or the tools of light so intense it cannot be evaded. The ghost type resists normal and fighting damage, but is vulnerable to its own darkness and to the radiance of fairy, which suggests that what belongs to shadow can be undone by the extremes on either side, by the dark beyond shadow and by the light beyond ordinary brightness. The Pokémon world's hidden architecture of type relationships is a kind of poetry. It takes abstract concepts, elemental forces, and emotional states, and arranges them in relationships of harmony and conflict that mirror the way these things actually relate to each other in the world. Fire warms, water sustains, ground supports, electric animates, poison corrupts, ice preserves, dragon endures. These are not arbitrary assignments. They are attempts to map something true about how the world's energies flow and interact. The villainous teams of each region carry ideas that are more serious than their presentation sometimes suggests. Team Rocket was the most straightforward of the early villains, a criminal organization interested in profit and control in the exploitation of Pokémon for money. Their presence in Kanto was a reminder that not everyone in the Pokémon world approached their relationship with these creatures with kindness and respect. Giovanni was the first gym leader to also be a criminal, which revealed something important. Authority and malice can occupy the same body. Team Aqua and Team Magma in Hoenn represented something more philosophically complex. Both teams believed they were acting for the benefit of the world, though their visions of what would benefit the world were directly opposed. Team Magma wanted to expand the land, to create more space for humans and land-dwelling creatures. Team Aqua wanted to expand the sea, to return the world to an earlier, more aquatic state. Both were wrong in their methods, and both were wrong in their certainty, but neither was entirely wrong in the thing they cared about. The world needs both land and water. The error was in believing that more of one thing is always better, and that the natural balance could be improved rather than simply respected. Team Galactic in Sinnoh was the most nihilistic of the early villains, led by a character who genuinely believed that the current universe, with all its feeling and attachment and suffering, was something that should be erased and remade as something purer and simpler. Cyrus wanted to destroy the world, not out of malice, but out of a kind of cold philosophical conviction. He had decided that emotion was the source of all suffering, and that a world without emotion would be a better world. He was wrong, but he was wrong in a way that required engaging with his actual argument, which is a more challenging kind of wrong than simple cruelty. Team Plasma in Unova raised the question that perhaps deserved to have been raised much earlier. Was the practice of keeping Pokémon in small capsules and having them battle actually ethical? The answer the games offered was nuanced rather than simple, which was appropriate. The answer was that the relationship between trainer and Pokémon was complicated, that it could be exploitative or it could be genuinely loving, and that the difference between those two things mattered enormously and could not be reduced to a rule. The hidden truth beneath all of the villainous teams is that they are not failures of imagination, but failures of balance. Each team pursued something real, something that genuinely mattered, and became monstrous in the pursuit of it, because they could not tolerate the complexity of a world in which the thing they valued existed alongside other things that also mattered. Team Rocket wanted profit. Team Aqua and Magma wanted a better world for the creatures they believed in. Cyrus wanted freedom from suffering. These are not meaningless desires. They became harmful because their holders could not hold them lightly enough to see what they were sacrificing in their pursuit. The Pokémon games have always been deeply interested in balance. Not just type balance or team balance, but the kind of balance that allows different things to coexist without one of them having to disappear. The legendary trios, the elemental relationships, the structure of evolution, the coexistence of day and night, summer and winter, fire and water. All of these are expressions of the same underlying idea. The world is held together by the tension between opposites, and when that tension is disrupted, the disruption is felt everywhere. In the original Red and Blue, there was a Pokémon called Porygon that could only be obtained in the Celadon Game Corner, the casino in Celadon City. Obtaining enough coins to trade for it required either significant luck at the slot machines or significant patience with a slow accumulation process. This was not a particularly gentle barrier, and the game offered no explanation for why a digital Pokémon was sold in a casino. The juxtaposition was simply there, waiting for someone to find it odd enough to think about. The game corner itself is a fascinating piece of design in retrospect. Pokémon games gradually moved away from the gambling mechanics that the earliest games included, replacing slot machines and coin games with more family-friendly alternatives in later remakes. The decision to include casinos at all in the original games reflects a different understanding of the audience, or perhaps a different idea about what was appropriate for the world being built. Looking back, the Game Corner feels like a glimpse of a version of Pokémon that was less careful about the signals it sent. The Sylph Scope, an item that allowed players to see the true forms of ghost Pokémon in Lavender Tower, was one of the earliest examples of Pokémon gating specific experiences behind specific items. Without the Sylph scope, the ghost on the upper floors of the tower appeared only as a faceless, unidentifiable form that could not be caught and could not be defeated permanently. With it, the ghost revealed itself as a Marowak, the mother of the Cubone you could catch on the tower's lower floors, killed by Team Rocket and unable to leave. This revelation, when it arrives, is one of the most quietly heartbreaking moments in the series. The ghost is not a threat, it is a mother who cannot leave the place where she died because her child is still there and still vulnerable. The Cubone, with its skull helmet and its bone club, is understood in a new way after this moment. The skull it wears is her skull. It has been carrying its grief on its head this entire time. The Marowak's Pokédex entries across multiple games return to this theme. They describe a Cubone that has overcome grief, that has taken the bone of the mother it lost and learned to use it with such skill that even fully grown Pokémon avoid confrontation. The grief becomes capability. The loss becomes the tool. There is something very old in this idea, and the games present it without commentary, without explanation, simply as a thing that happens in the world. The hidden stories in Pokémon are often the quietest ones. They do not announce themselves. They are found in Pokédex entries, read at 3 in the morning, in conversations with NPCs who say something that seems like passing dialogue until you realize it changes everything you thought you understood about the place you are in the design of a Pokémon that only makes full sense when you know the mythology it draws from or the natural behavior it is encoding. Lampent, one of the ghost-type Pokémon introduced in Unova, is described as a creature that hangs around hospitals and absorbs the souls of the dying. It is a candlestick that feeds on the departing. This is not gently presented. The entry does not soften it. Lampent waits for death and uses it to sustain itself, and the Pokédex states this plainly. The fact that Lampent evolves into Chandelure, an elegant and beautiful chandelier Pokémon, adds a particular quality to the evolution. What comes after the consumption of something precious is sometimes more beautiful than what came before it, and that beauty does not necessarily justify the consumption. Gengar, to return to a creature mentioned earlier, is described in several Pokédex entries as the shadow of a Clefable. The two Pokémon share a silhouette that, when placed together, suggests that one is the literal shadow of the other. This detail, embedded in the design and confirmed in the lore, transforms both Pokémon. Clefable becomes something whose dark reflection walks alongside it in places where it cannot see. Gengar becomes something that is defined entirely by its relationship to an innocence it will never possess. The Slowpoke, Shellder, and Slowbro relationship is one of the most structurally interesting in the series. Shellder, a creature of the ocean, is known in the wild for clamping onto things with considerable force. When a Shellder bites a Slowpoke's tail, the venom it injects transforms the Slowpoke's mind, and Slowpoke becomes Slowbro. The brain's processing speed increases dramatically, though the Pokemon's personality and general unhurriedness remain unchanged. Slowbro is smarter than Slowpoke. It became so by being bitten by something that was trying to harm it. If Slowbro is separated from the Shellder, either by force or by the Shellder releasing of its own accord, the Slowbro reverts to Slowpoke. The transformation is not permanent. The intelligence was not Slowpoke's to keep. It belonged to the relationship. This is a strange and somewhat melancholy fact, and it sits in the Pokédex without much ceremony. Slowpoke becomes what it becomes through an encounter it did not choose, and which, if it ended, would remove most of what it had gained. Slowking is the other path, the result of a Shellder biting a Slowpoke's head rather than its tail. In this case, the intelligence emerges even more dramatically. Slowking is described as having achieved a level of wisdom that allows it to find solutions to any problem, a Pokemon that grows wiser and more insightful the more time passes with the shelter in its current position. It is royalty, as its name suggests. It is the version of Slowpoke that has been transformed not just into something smarter, but into something genuinely great. The relationship between Slowpoke and Shelter, repeated across Slowbro and Slowking, suggests something about symbiosis that the games never quite articulate directly. The two creatures need each other for either to become its fullest self. Shelter alone is a simple bivalve. Slowpoke alone is famously limited. But together, in the right configuration, they become something extraordinary. The whole exceeds the sum of its parts. This is not unique to Pokémon biology, but the way the game embeds it in creature design, rather than stating it directly, is part of what makes it feel true rather than instructional. The hidden symbioses of the Pokémon world are scattered through the lore in ways that reward careful reading. Corsola, the coral Pokémon, provides shelter for small sea creatures in its branches. Remoraid clings to Mantine, cleaning parasites from its skin in exchange for the crumbs of food that fall from Mantine's mouth. These relationships mirror real ecological interdependencies in a way that teaches something true about the natural world while presenting it as something wonderful rather than merely functional. The Pokémon Wishiwashi, introduced in Sun and Moon, is one of the most dramatic expressions of this collective principle. A single Wishiwashi is tiny and almost entirely helpless, with statistics that make it one of the weakest Pokémon in the game. But when Wishiwashi gather in schools, they form a collective shape so massive and so visually overwhelming that it resembles a predator large enough to terrify almost anything in the ocean. The strength does not belong to any individual Wishiwashi. It belongs to the school, to the decision of many small things to become one large thing in a moment of need. This is one of the most direct statements of a collective philosophy that the series has ever made, and it is presented in the design of a small, sad-looking fish. The lesson is embedded in the creature without being spelled out. The creature is the lesson. A Pokémon caught in 1999 and transferred through multiple games across multiple consoles still carries the date of its original capture. That date is recorded in its data, a small numerical fact that contains an entire childhood. When veteran players transfer these ancient Pokémon forward, they are moving something across time in a way that the games never quite acknowledge, but that feels, to those who do it, genuinely significant. There are Pikachus and Charmanders in the world that were caught by children who are now adults, parents, people with entirely different lives than the ones they were living when the capture was made. The Pokémon remembers, in its data, if not in any experiential sense, a moment that the player may or may not be able to recall. There is something very strange and very tender about this persistence. The Pokémon world has always taken memory seriously as a theme. Marowak's memory of its mother, Kubon's inability to let go. The ancient legends that explain how the world was made. The scattered descendants of a creator who shaped continents before withdrawing to a place no ordinary trainer could reach. Memory in this world has weight and consequence. It shapes the present even when the thing being remembered is very old. The old Pokémon in the cemetery on Lavender Town's tower are there because someone remembered them enough to bury them. Someone made the trip, found the place, and placed the stone. The world of Pokémon has always suggested that these creatures' lives matter, that their ends are events that deserve acknowledgement, that the relationship between trainer and Pokémon carries a grief component as well as a joy component. In Pokémon Amy and its successor, Pokémon Refresh, features introduced in later games allowed players to interact with their Pokémon between battles, to feed them, play with them, notice when they were hurt or tired, and respond accordingly. The mechanic was optional. It changed nothing necessary about the game. But the players who used it reported feeling differently about their Pokémon. The creatures became less abstract. The relationship became more textured. The care became visible in small animations and responses that acknowledged that attention had been paid. Hidden in these optional systems was a question about what the Pokémon experience is actually about. Is it about collecting and battling, the accumulation of power, and the demonstration of mastery? Or is it about something slower and quieter, something more like what it feels like to be responsible for a creature that trusts you? Both answers are available in every game. The player chooses which game they are actually playing. The mystery of Pokémon eggs has always carried a particular quality of the unexplained. Eggs appear at the daycare, but their appearance is managed with discretion. The old couple who run the facility speak of finding the egg, not creating it. The biological specifics are handled by silence. The game offers the egg without explanation and asks you to carry it until it hatches, which requires walking a certain distance with the egg in your party. The hatching of a Pokémon from an egg is one of the series' most consistently satisfying moments, precisely because it requires patience without explanation. You walk with something that does not yet exist in any complete sense, that is becoming, that needs the steady movement of the journey in order to arrive. And then it arrives, often at an unexpected moment, a small cry, a brief animation, and a creature that was not there before and now entirely is. The act of hatching an egg says something about what journeys are for. You are not just traveling from one place to another. You are creating the conditions for something to come into being. The destination matters less than the motion. The motion is what the becoming requires. In Pokémon Diamond and Pearl, there is an area called the Old Chateau, an abandoned mansion deep in the Eterna Forest. The mansion is dark and musty, its rooms filled with static portraits and tattered curtains, its corridors populated by a Rotom that haunts the television set in one of the rooms. But the old chateau contains something else, something that requires the player to be observant in ways the game does not announce. In two of the rooms, non-interactable NPCs can be seen. A little girl drifts through one room. A butler stands in another. They cannot be spoken to. They cannot be caught or battled. They appear, and then when the player enters the room, they may have disappeared, or they may still be visible, depending on where you are standing and what the camera shows you. The game never explains who they are, what they were doing in this mansion, or why they continue to remain in its rooms when everything else that once lived here has long since departed. This detail, this presence of figures who exist in the world but cannot be interacted with, who appear and then seem to have gone, is one of the most quietly unsettling things in the series. The Old Chateau is a ghost story that the game tells entirely through placement and silence. There are no words about what happened here. There is only the accumulation of empty rooms and curtains, and the awareness that these presences are there even when you cannot see them. The distortion world in Pokémon Platinum, the realm where Giratina lived, inverted the logic of navigation entirely. Gravity shifted. What was floor became wall, became ceiling. Platforms floated without explanation. The paths forward required solving spatial puzzles in 3 dimensions, turning the player's understanding of how to move through a space against itself. The distortion world was not just visually unusual, it was experientially disorienting in a way that felt appropriate for a realm whose existence was defined by being the opposite of ordinary reality. Giratina itself, in its origin form, was a creature that moved by swimming through this inverted space rather than walking on solid ground. It was designed to inhabit a place that could not be navigated by ordinary means. The moment of encountering it, Deep in a world that should not be accessible through any ordinary route was one of the most atmospheric legendary encounters in the series, precisely because the journey to it had already made the player feel genuinely dislocated. The hidden dimensions of the Pokemon worlds, the distortion world, the dream world accessible through the Gen 5 games, the ultra space of Sun and Moon, all represent the same impulse, a desire to suggest that the world players think they know is not the whole world. There is always more, always another layer, always a space that ordinary existence does not encompass. The Pokemon world is larger than it appears, always. The Ultra Beasts of Sun and Moon were perhaps the most radical expression of this expansiveness. These were not Pokemon in the ordinary sense. They were creatures from other dimensions, arrived through wormholes in the fabric of space, as alien to the Pokemon world as they were to any player encountering them. Their designs were deliberately strange, more abstract than most Pokemon, shaped by aesthetic principles that felt unfamiliar because they literally came from somewhere else. Nihilego was a jellyfish-like creature made of glass, a UB whose contact with humans was described as causing them to become possessed by a euphoric recklessness, a burning desire to accomplish something at any cost. It was the Ultra Beast that most directly interacted with the human characters of Sun and Moon, and its influence was part of what made the story of those games more psychologically complex than the series had attempted before. The villain of Sun and Moon was not someone who had chosen cruelty. She was someone who had been shaped by contact with something she could not resist, and that did not have her best interests at heart. The hidden depths of Pokemon villains, when they are written with care, reveal people rather than monsters. Team Skull, the villainous team of Sun and Moon, were not powerful or philosophically ambitious. They were people who had failed at the Island Challenge, the regional rite of passage, and had found in each other a community of the unsuccessful. Their leader, Guzma, was eventually revealed to be a person who had been taught that only victory mattered and who had collapsed under the weight of that teaching. He was a bully because he had been bullied. He led a gang because belonging somewhere was the only comfort available when you could not be what you were told you needed to be. The detail of Guzma's backstory, delivered in fragments across the game rather than in a single direct revelation, is one of the better pieces of character writing in the series. The fragments are easy to miss. They require paying attention to NPCs who seem like background characters, to locations that seem like incidental settings, to conversations that seem like optional flavor. But assembled, they produce a person with a genuine history, a person whose choices make sense in a way that simple villainy never quite does. Fishermen in every Pokemon game stand at the edges of water and cast their lines with a patience that the player is never asked to share. They are there when you arrive, and they are there when you leave. They have been fishing since before you came to this route, and they will continue after you have gone. Their existence is not explained and does not need to be. They are part of the world in the same way that people sitting on benches in real parks are part of the world, present, visible, going about something that has nothing to do with you. The background figures of the Pokemon world, the hikers who have been crossing the same mountain for years, the sailors who never seem to sail anywhere but are always near the docks, the school children who appear in clusters discussing something you will never hear the entirety of. Those figures create a sense that the world exists beyond the player's perspective. The story is yours, but the world is not. The world was there before you and will continue after you, and you are moving through it rather than containing it. The music that plays in Pokemon centers carries a particular quality of comfort that has become one of the most recognizable sounds in gaming. It is warm and simple, a loop that signals rest and recovery and the possibility of trying again. The sound of the PC saving data, the nurse's thank you, the brief melody that plays as your Pokemon are restored, These are among the most deeply conditioned sounds for anyone who grew up playing these games. They mean safety. They mean that the difficult thing is over, at least for now, and that you can breathe. Pokemon music has always carried more emotional weight than its technical simplicity suggests it should. The composer Junichi Masuda, who wrote the music for the earliest games, understood that players would spend long hours in the world, and that the music needed to be something that could be present in the background of a life, not just in the foreground of an experience. Music that demanded attention could not serve that function. Music that created an atmosphere and then stepped back into it could. The gym leader music in the various games is designed for confrontation, but not for aggression. It is urgent without being hostile. It signals that something important is happening without suggesting that importance requires overwhelming force. The Elite Four music is more serious, more sustained, less playful. By the time you reach the champion, the music has become something that belongs to the weight of the moment, something that understands you have come a very long way. The moment when champion music plays for the first time is different for everyone, but recognizable across generations. It is the music of having arrived somewhere. It does not celebrate. It witnesses. It is present for the thing that is happening, and then it continues, as all music does, while you stand in the middle of what you have just accomplished. The hidden truth of Pokémon, perhaps the deepest and simplest one, is that the games are about becoming. You begin as someone who does not yet know what they are capable of. You move through a world that challenges you repeatedly and offers you companions for the journey. You make choices about who to bring along and what to prioritize. And then, eventually, in a room somewhere that you have been working toward for the entire game, you discover that you have become something you were not when you started. This arc is not unique to Pokémon. It is one of the oldest stories humans tell, but Pokémon tells it in a way that is specifically its own, a way that involves small creatures and friendship and the particular quality of attention that comes from noticing things carefully. The hidden secrets of the Pokémon world are not hidden because they were meant to be found only by the most determined players. They are hidden because they belong to the kind of world that reveals itself gradually, that offers more the more honestly you engage with it. The greatest secret the Pokémon world contains is not the location of a legendary Pokémon or the meaning of a name or the structure of a type system. It is the fact that the world is genuinely rich enough to keep revealing itself. That after all these years, after all these games, after everything that has been analyzed and documented and debated, there are still things that only become visible when you slow down enough to look for them. The Pokémon world is not a finished place. It is a living one, constantly generating new connections and new meanings as players bring their own understanding to it. Every generation of players finds something the previous generation overlooked, not because the previous generation was less observant, but because every pair of eyes brings a different history to what it sees. The world that a child of the 90s found in Kanto is not the same world that a child of today finds there, even though every tree and root in rival battle is exactly the same. The world changes because the player changes. The secrets reveal themselves to whoever is ready to receive them. As we drift toward the end of this particular journey, it is worth sitting quietly with the fullness of what the Pokémon world contains, the geological depth of its legendary mythology, the careful philosophy of its type systems, the quiet sadness of its ghost types and its fossil Pokémon and its creatures who carry their grief on their heads, the warmth of its Pokémon centers and its waiting Eevees and its starter Pokémon who are already tilting toward you before the choice is even made. The hidden secrets of Pokémon are not separate from its surface. They are its surface, seen at a different angle, in a different light, at a different time of day. The world that looks simple to a rushing player is the same world that reveals extraordinary depth to a patient one. The treasure is in the looking. The discovery is in the willingness to slow down enough to notice what was always there. The Pokémon world has been saying the same true things since 1996 in the colors of town names and the names of legendary birds and the silhouette of a clamshell Pokémon biting the tail of something that didn't seem like it needed or wanted what that bite would give it. It has been saying these things in the music of roots and the melancholy of ghost towers and the warmth of places built for recovery and rest. It has been saying them in the design of creatures that carry their origins in their shapes, that speak their natures through their names, that exist in relationships of harmony and tension that mirror the actual structure of a world worth living in. What the Pokémon world knows, and what it has always been trying to tell anyone who moves through it carefully enough to hear, is that the most valuable things are usually the quietest ones. They do not announce themselves, they do not insist on being noticed, they wait patiently and without urgency for someone who is ready to receive them. And when you find them, when you finally see what was always there, you do not feel that you have discovered something new. You feel instead that you have remembered something you already knew. The Pokémon world's approach to friendship is one of its most carefully developed and least examined dimensions. From the earliest games, there was a value called happiness or friendship that accumulated in the background, invisible to most players, shaping the behavior of their Pokémon in ways that were easy to miss unless you knew precisely what to look for. A Pokémon with very high friendship would survive hits that should have ended it. It would succeed where the odds said it should fail. It would, in battle, do the thing that love asks of things that love something enough. The mechanics that build friendship in the games are a revealing list. Walking with a Pokémon in your party, feeding it vitamins, having it massaged at specific locations, allowing it to level up, avoiding letting it faint in battle, avoiding the use of bitter herbal medicine on it. The list encodes a theory of what relationships require, which is time, attention, care, and the avoidance of unnecessary harm. A Pokémon that you walk with and feed and keep from fainting trusts you more than one you ignore. This is not a profound observation, but its presence in the mechanical structure of the game as a concrete value that has concrete effects makes it something more than an observation. It makes it a commitment. The games that made friendship most visible were the ones that allowed the player to pet their Pokémon directly. Pokémon Amy in X and Y, and its successor Pokémon Refresh in Sun and Moon, and the camp system in Sword and Shield, all offered spaces in which the interaction between trainer and Pokémon was not about combat or strategy, but simply about presence. You could stroke the screen near your Pokémon. You could play with it. You could notice when it was hungry or when it had taken a status effect in battle and needed to have its face cleaned. The Pokémon responded. It looked at you. It turned toward whatever you were doing. And something happened in that space of simple interaction that the games acknowledged through the mechanics of friendship, but that felt, to players who spent time there, like something real. The secret hidden within these friendship mechanics is that they were always a design statement about what kind of relationship the creators hoped players would have with their Pokémon. Not purely instrumental, not defined only by the battles won or the stats accumulated. The ideal trainer, encoded in the mechanics, was someone who walked with their Pokémon, who cared for it after battle, who understood that the creature accompanying them was not just a tool for accomplishing objectives, but something that had its own needs and its own responses to being met or unmet. This is a gentle but genuine argument, and it has been present in the series since before most players noticed it. The games have always been gently insisting that care matters. that attention matters, that the quality of a relationship determines what is possible within it, and they have been encoding that insistence in the numbers, in the mechanical structures, in the things that change when friendship is high, and the things that do not change when it is low. Evolution in Pokemon began as a simple matter of reaching a certain level of experience. You trained your Pokemon, it grew stronger, and at certain thresholds it became something new. This was clean and clear, and it encoded the idea that growth comes from accumulated experience, that the creature you become is shaped by the challenges you have moved through. Caterpie became Metapod became Butterfree. Magikarp became Gyarados. The simplicity of the mechanism made its underlying statement clear, but the series quickly began to complicate this simplicity with new methods of evolution that encoded different ideas about what transformation requires. Stones introduced the idea that some transformations need an external catalyst. The Firestone transforms certain creatures. The Waterstone transforms others. The Thunderstone, the Moonstone, the Sunstone, the Shiny Stone, the Dusk Stone, the Dawn Stone. Each stone is associated with an elemental force or a quality of light, and each one triggers a transformation in creatures that are somehow already prepared for it. The stone does not create the transformation from nothing. It activates something that was waiting. The potential was always there. The stone is simply what was needed to release it. The Moonstone deserves particular attention. It transforms Nidorina into Nidoqueen, Nidorino into Nidoking, Jigglypuff into Wigglytuff, Clefairy into Clefable, Skitty into Delcatty. These are all creatures associated with softness and night and a kind of otherworldly quality, creatures that seem to belong to the hours when the moon is out, rather than the hours when the sun is overhead. The Moonstone calls to them specifically because they are already aligned with what it represents. The stone and the creature meet each other halfway. Trait evolution, introduced in the first generation, was a radically different mechanism. Some Pokemon evolved not through training or through the application of a catalyst, but through being given to someone else and then received back. The act of exchange itself was transformative. Graveler became Golem when traded. Haunter became Gengar. Machoke became Machamp. Kadabra became Alakazam. The evolutionary mechanism of trading is a statement about relationships and context. These creatures cannot reach their full form alone or through the ordinary process of solitary growth. They need to pass through another person's hands. They need to experience what it means to leave one relationship and enter another even temporarily. And when they come back, they are different for having gone. Friendship evolution, as distinct from the general mechanics of the friendship stat, required that a Pokemon have a very high friendship level when it leveled up. This meant that Eevee became Espeon or Umbreon, not at any fixed level, but at whatever level happened to occur when the relationship was strong enough. The timing was determined by the quality of the bond, not by any external milestone. You could rush through the levels and never trigger the evolution. You could spend months walking with the Pokemon before the level and the friendship aligned at the same moment. The game was patient about this. It would wait until the conditions were genuinely met. This location-based evolution introduced yet another variable, place. Magneton became Magnezone only in areas with strong magnetic fields. Leafeon evolved near ancient mossy rocks in specific forests. Glaceon evolved near specific ice-covered stones. Inkai became Malamar only when the game was held upside down, which was a detail so specific and so physical that it seemed almost like a joke before it became clear that it was simply another expression of the principle that some transformations require unusual conditions. The evolution was waiting for a particular orientation. The creature knew what it needed, even if the player did not. beauty evolution, used for Phoebus in the Generation 3 games, was perhaps the most demanding and most poetic of the conditional evolutions. Phoebus was a deliberately ugly and unremarkable Pokémon, a fish that appeared to have no particular qualities worth developing. But if you raised its beauty contest stat sufficiently, by feeding it specific Pokeblocks or poffins crafted from berries, and then leveled it up, it became melodic, which was among the most visually striking Pokémon in the game. The beauty had to be developed from within, nurtured deliberately, before the outer form could reflect it. What Phoebus was inside was always there. The process of becoming melodic was the process of making that inner quality visible. The Phoebus to melodic evolution is one of the clearest expressions of a theme that runs through the entire series. Things are not always what they appear to be. The plain and the overlooked sometimes contain the most significant potential. The creature that seems to offer nothing may be waiting for exactly the right conditions to reveal what it actually is. Melodic, one of the most beautiful Pokémon in existence, comes from Phoebus, which is almost universally considered one of the least. The gap between them is one of the largest in the series, and it is crossed not through fighting or power, but through care and patience, and the deliberate cultivation of something the game calls beauty, but which might equally be called dignity, or worth, or the simple quality of being seen for what you actually are. The relationship between Snubbull and Granbull is a character arc embedded in a two-stage evolution. Snubbull, a small pink bulldog with a wide mouth full of enormous teeth, is described in its Pokédex entries as frightening to small Pokémon despite its bright pink color and its general air of distress. Small Pokémon run from it. It does not understand why. It only wants to play. The wide mouth and the large teeth are the features that frightened creatures see first, and they run before they can notice the large eyes that are a little sad and a little hopeful and entirely unbothered by the fact that this keeps happening. Granbull, the evolution, is simply more of everything. Bigger teeth, larger frame, more of the same features that cause the same problem. But Granbull, in certain entries, is described as having developed a timid personality despite its formidable appearance. It evolved into something that looks even more alarming and remained underneath that appearance, something that simply wants companionship and keeps being denied it by the first impression it cannot help making. There is something very honest about this line. The gap between what you appear to be and what you are, and the experience of having creatures respond to the appearance before they can reach the reality underneath, is something that exists well beyond the Pokémon world. The design of Snubbull and Granbull holds this experience with gentleness and without resolution. The evolution does not fix the problem. It intensifies it, and the Pokémon continue, undeterred, still wanting what they want, and still finding that what they want keeps retreating from them. Houndour and Houndoom carry a different kind of hidden narrative, one about reputation and the failure of understanding. Houndoom, a dark and fire-type Pokémon designed to resemble a hellhound, is described in some entries as running in packs and coordinating through howls. Other entries that describe the burns inflicted by Houndoom's fire as uniquely painful, persisting long after the flame has been extinguished. The design and the lore conspire to make Houndoom seem like a creature of darkness and threat. But other entries describe Houndoom as a fiercely loyal pack animal that cares for injured members of its group, that will call for allies when it encounters an enemy rather than fighting alone, that has an elaborate social structure built on cooperation. The creature that appears frightening is the same creature that is deeply social, that operates through loyalty and connection rather than through cruelty. The appearance and the reality are in conversation with each other, neither entirely canceling the other. Shuppet and Banette are among the most philosophically unsettling designs in the series. Shuppet is described as a Pokémon that feeds on negative emotions, hovering near people who are experiencing jealousy or resentment or spite and absorbing those feelings as nourishment. It is drawn to darkness, not the darkness of geography, but the darkness of emotional state. It seeks out the places within people where the unkind feelings live. Banette, its evolution, has one of the most haunting origin stories in the Pokédex. It is described as a puppet that was thrown away by a child who grew tired of it, a doll that developed such intense hatred and desire for revenge against the child who discarded it that it became a living Pokémon. The zipper on Banette's mouth, when opened, releases the curse energy that sustains it. If the zipper opens fully and the energy escapes, Banette ceases to exist. The story embedded in Banette's design is the story of what happens to the things we discard when we are done with them. Not the physical objects, though those are also part of the story, but the emotional investments we withdraw from without explanation, the attachments we sever without acknowledgement. Banette is the unconsidered feeling given form and motion and a very long memory. Froslass, a ghost and ice type introduced in Generation 4, is based on a specific figure from Japanese folklore, the Yuki-onna, or Snow Woman, a spirit that appears to travelers on mountain roads in blizzards. In the mythology, the Yuki-onna is sometimes benevolent and sometimes deadly, depending on the version of the story. She is always beautiful, always cold, always encountered in a place where survival is already uncertain. Froslass's Pokédex entries describe it as a creature that freezes those it finds on snowy mountains and displays the frozen figures in its icy lair. The entries are matter-of-fact about this. The figures are described as beautiful in their frozen state, which gives the collecting a quality of appreciation that makes it more unsettling rather than less. Froslass considers these frozen figures treasures. The things it has collected and keeps are also the things it has ended. The ghost type has always been willing to sit with ideas that the rest of the series handles more gently. The design of ghost Pokémon across the generations reveals a consistent engagement with the concept of things that continue after they should have stopped, that persist in forms they were not originally intended to have, that carry the weight of something unfinished into a present that belongs to other things. Ghost Pokémon are the past refusing to stop being present. They are the evidence that endings are rarely as complete as they appear. The music of Alola, the region introduced in Sun and Moon, was built on a specific set of instruments and rhythmic structures that reflected Hawaiian music's own architecture. Steel guitar tones appeared in routes that overlooked the ocean. Percussion patterns that belonged to traditional Polynesian music underscored moments of ceremony. The region felt warm and coastal and specific in a way that Pokémon regions had not quite managed before, and much of that specificity came from the music choosing to represent as a particular cultural and geographic reality rather than a generic fantasy version of it. The Festival Plaza music in those games, the cheerful and slightly chaotic sound that played while trainers gathered to interact, captured something of the social energy of a busy waterfront market, which is exactly what it was designed to evoke. Music can do this work when it is written with genuine attention to what a place actually sounds like, and the composers of Sun and Moon were clearly listening. The Galar region of Sword and Shield had music that drew from British musical traditions in ways that were sometimes subtle and sometimes quite direct. The Wild Area, the open-world section of those games, where weather changed in real time and powerful Pokémon wandered freely, had music that shifted with the weather, brightening in sun and deepening in rain, becoming something almost cinematic when the skies turned stormy. The music was not constant. It responded. It was part of the world rather than a track playing over it. The stadium themes that played during gym battles in Sword and Shield were designed to evoke the sonic experience of a major sporting event, with crowd vocals building during the more dramatic moments of a match. The gyms in Galar were explicitly described as professional sporting events with large audiences, and the music honored that conceit completely. There was something genuinely exciting about hearing a crowd react to what was happening on the field, even a crowd in a game, even a crowd responding to Pokémon battles rather than football. The feeling of consequence that a crowd creates translated into the game's logic and made those battles feel more significant than the mechanical stakes alone could manage. The music of Pokémon Legends, Arceus, set in a historical Sinnoh that predated the modern games by many generations, reached for something that sounded genuinely ancient, instruments with an older quality, harmonics that belonged to music that was not trying to be modern, that was content to sound like what it was supposed to represent. A world still finding its relationship with the Pokémon that shared it. The absence of certain familiar melodic elements in that game's music was itself a statement. The world was not yet what it would become. The music knew this and respected it. Paldea, the region of Scarlet and Violet, produced some of the most texturally interesting music in the series, drawing from Spanish and Iberian musical traditions in ways that gave the region a specific cultural identity. The town music changed subtly depending on where in the region you were. The mountain towns sounded different from the coastal towns. The ancient ruins had music that felt genuinely old beneath its modern production. The game's score was one of its most successful elements, creating a sense of place that the somewhat uneven graphics could not always achieve. The ruins of Alf in Johto were one of the earliest examples of a location that existed to suggest a history the games would never fully explain. The unknown who lived there formed an alphabet, but the alphabet could not be read as a message. They simply were there, ancient and inscrutable, assembled in a place where puzzles embedded in the walls depicted their shapes, as though whatever civilization had built those walls had understood the unknown and had wanted to mark that understanding, but the civilization was gone. What remained was the marking and the unknown themselves, who did not explain anything. The sealed chamber in Hoenn, a location under the ocean accessible through dive, contained the instructions for finding the Reggie legendary Pokémon. The instructions were written in Braille on the walls of a chamber that had clearly been built to hold exactly this information, built by someone or something that expected others to come looking, and that had chosen this language, Braille, as the medium of transmission. Why Braille? The game does not say. The answer might be hidden somewhere, or it might simply be that the civilization that built the chamber had its own reasons that the modern world does not have access to. The Sinjo ruins, accessible in Heart Gold and Soul Silver through an event interaction between those games and Pokémon Platinum, were a location that did not belong to either region where the games were set. They existed in a space between Sinnoh and Johto, connected to both but fully belonging to neither. The ruins contained imagery that linked the mythologies of the two regions, suggesting that the legendary Pokémon associated with each had a shared history that predated the development of the regions themselves. The Temple of Sinistea in Sword and Shield's DLC, a location connected to the mystery of a particular Pokémon whose backstory was deliberately obscured, carried the feeling of a place where something significant had happened without anyone present to describe what it was. The history was in the architecture, in the layout, in the details of the decoration, but it was not narrated. It was simply shown, and the understanding of what it meant was left to the player who chose to put the pieces together. These locations share a quality that is specific to the Pokémon world's approach to history. The history is real, but the explanation is not provided. The civilization that built the ruins of Alf is gone. The culture that created the sealed chamber's Braille instructions is gone. Whatever built the Temple of Sinistea is not accessible to any character in the game. The history exists, but cannot be interrogated, can only be observed, can only be experienced as the presence of something that was once very significant and has not been forgotten by the world, even though no living person can explain it. This is actually how history works in the real world, for most of it and for most of human experience. The evidence remains. The explanation is unavailable. We find things, and we know that they mattered, and we cannot always know to whom or why. The Pokémon world encodes this experience of history in its ruined places and its ancient Pokémon and its Pokédex entries that mention events that occurred millions of years ago as though they were recent enough to have left clear marks. In this world, time is not entirely linear, and the past is not entirely past. Zorua and Zoroark, introduced in Generation 5, are Pokémon whose entire design and lore are built around illusion. Zorua, the small fox Pokémon, disguises itself as other Pokémon, or as human children, in order to move through the world without attracting attention. The mechanic of its ability in the games changes what it appears to be until something forces the illusion to drop. You might think you are battling one Pokémon and realize only when it takes damage or uses a certain move that you are battling something entirely different. The game used this mechanic for one of its most remarkable narrative moments. In Black and White, when the player first encountered a certain Pokémon, it appeared in the shape of a young child. As the story of that particular encounter developed, the illusion dropped and Zorua revealed itself. The game had been playing an illusion on the player, not just on the characters, and the revelation that the child you had been interacting with was actually a small fox Pokémon that had chosen this form for reasons that the story explained carried a genuine emotional weight. Zorua's transformation ability is described in the lore as a survival mechanism. Small and not particularly powerful, it survives by appearing to be something that is not worth attacking or not worth the trouble. The illusion is not deception for its own sake. It is protection. With the creature that needs to appear to be something else is the creature that understands its vulnerability and has found an answer to it that does not require fighting. Kecleon, an earlier example of a camouflage Pokémon, took a different approach. It could change the color of its body to match almost any background, becoming nearly invisible against most surfaces. But its zigzag stripe across its belly never changed color. This small inconsistency was its tell, the thing that made it findable to anyone who knew what to look for. Perfect camouflage was not what the design offered. What it offered was camouflage with one persistent exception, which is perhaps more honest. Ditto's transformation, as mentioned earlier, was imperfect in the face. The face was always slightly wrong. Kecleon could not change its belly stripe. Zorua's illusion dropped under specific conditions. The Pokémon world seems to believe that nothing can be entirely hidden, that every concealment has its limit, that the thing underneath always finds some way to remain visible to those who look with the right quality of attention. The hidden ability system introduced specific abilities to Pokémon that were not their default abilities, things that could only be obtained through specific methods, and that changed the creature's behavior in battle in ways that made it usable in contexts where its ordinary abilities did not serve it as well. These hidden abilities were not secret in any deep sense. They were documented and sought after. But the name of the system carried a suggestion that abilities could be hidden, that what a creature was capable of was not always fully visible in its ordinary presentation. The Dream Worlds, the online feature associated with Black and White, was specifically built around the concept of reaching abilities that Pokémon had, but could not ordinarily access. In the Dream World, Pokémon were dreaming, and in their dreams, their hidden capacities became available. The metaphor was unusually direct for a game mechanic. The things a creature can do that it cannot ordinarily do are things it accesses in dreams. The potential exists, but requires an unusual state of consciousness to reach. The concept of a Pokemon's hidden potential being something that exists in its dream state connects unexpectedly to the experience of anyone who has ever woken from a dream in which they were capable of something they could not do while awake. The dream allows access to capacities that the waking state constrains. The Pokemon world, in naming a feature the dream world and filling it with the hidden abilities of sleeping creatures, was encoding a genuine truth in the language of mechanics. There are more than 1,000 Pokemon now, 1,000 different creatures, each with its own design, its own type, its own Pokédex entry, its own place in the world's ecology. Each one the result of a conversation between designers and directors and artists and writers, each one carrying the mark of specific intentions and specific inspirations and specific moments in the creative process where someone decided that this idea was ready and that one was not. Among 1,000 creatures, every player has their own canon. The ones they remember, the ones they trained for the first time and carried through their first adventure, the ones whose designs surprised them or moved them or made them laugh, the ones they have transferred through 4 or 5 or 6 games, carrying a small digital file that represents a relationship they have had for 20 years with something that does not exist except in code and the memory of the player who cares about it. This relationship between player and Pokemon across time and across the changes in life that the years bring is perhaps the final hidden secret of the series. It is not hidden in any location you can visit or any Pokédex entry you can read. It is hidden in the simple fact of caring, of returning, of finding that a creature you chose when you were young still means something to you in a way that time has not diminished. The world of Pokémon has spent 30 years building a place worth returning to, a place with enough depth that each return finds something new, a place with enough warmth that the returning feels like coming home, a place that takes seriously the idea that friendship matters, that time matters, that the quality of attention you bring to the world determines what the world reveals to you. Every hidden secret in this world, every detail embedded in a name or a design or a Pokédex entry or a route or a piece of music that plays only in a specific location during a specific kind of weather is an expression of this seriousness. The designers believed that the world deserved to be treated as something real, and because they believed it, the world became real in the way that places built with belief become real, not through physics, but through the quality of attention that their creation called forth and that players have been bringing to them ever since. The hidden secrets of Pokémon are not a list. They are a practice, the practice of looking carefully, of reading the entries, of speaking to the NPCs who seem like background characters, of noticing the name of the town you are in and wondering why it was named that, of watching the sky change as the hours pass and noticing which creatures come out and which ones disappear, of staying in one place long enough to see what happens when you are patient, when you stop moving toward the next objective and simply let the world be what it is. This is the practice the world has always been inviting, and it is, as it turns out, not very different from the practice of resting, of slowing down, of allowing the things you have accumulated across the day to settle, to find their places, to stop demanding your immediate attention. The world of Pokémon has always known something about rest. It has always known that the best things are found when you are not hurrying. The colors of a journey move from white to black, through every shade in between, and the path is never straight, and the music that plays along it is always exactly right for the moment you are in, and somewhere in the tall grass there is always something you have not found yet, something that has been waiting quietly in exactly the right place for exactly the right person to arrive and finally look. The way individual Pokemon games handle the concept of evil deserves its own slow examination. Each villainous team in the series represents a different face of the same underlying failure, and the specifics of that failure tell us something about what the creators thought was worth warning against in the moment each game was made. Team Rocket operated from a simple premise. Pokemon were resources to be exploited, not beings to be respected. Giovanni understood exactly what he was doing and chose to do it anyway, which is perhaps the most honest kind of villainy. He did not convince himself that exploitation was actually protection, or that profit was actually justice. He simply wanted what he wanted and took it. The games positioned the player's trainer, who chose partnership over exploitation, as the natural answer to Giovanni's philosophy. The argument was made through contrast rather than through speech. What is easy to miss is that Team Rocket's presence in the Pokemon world was always also a commentary on certain real industries that existed in the world of the game's creators. The organization that harvested slowpoke tails, that separated Pokemon from their trainers for sale, that transformed what could be a relationship into a commodity, these were recognizable patterns. The game addressed them by making them the primary obstacle of the adventure, by positioning the player and their Pokemon as the answer to them, and by never making the alternative seem complicated. It was simple. Respect matters. Partnership matters. The relationship is not reducible to its economic value. Team Skull in Alola, despite being the least powerful villainous team in the series, was perhaps the most honest in its depiction of how people who have failed find each other. The members of Team Skull failed the Island Challenge, the rite of passage that structured Alolan society. They could not find acceptance through the ordinary channels, and so they built an acceptance of their own in an abandoned town, in a style that was deliberately at odds with the aesthetics of the region around them. The black and silver, the crossed bones, the exaggerated postures, all of it was performance, the performance of not caring from people who cared very much. Guzma, their leader, was revealed to have been the student of the previous island kahuna, someone who had tried and failed to master what he most admired and had spent years defining himself by that failure. The detail that made him genuinely interesting was the detail of the broken golf clubs in the room where you eventually found him, evidence of a rage directed inward toward the self that could not do what it needed to do. A person who breaks things in private is a person with nowhere to put what they feel. Team Skull was Guzma's answer to that problem. It gave the feeling somewhere to go. The Ether Foundation, the ostensible benefactors of Sun and Moon, who maintained a facility dedicated to injured Pokemon, was eventually revealed to be as exploitative as any villainous team, driven by a grief so total that it had become indistinguishable from cruelty. Lusamine, the Foundation's leader, had lost someone she loved to the Ultra Wormhole, and her response to that loss was to pursue obsessively the creatures that came through those wormholes, not because they could return what she had lost, but because they were connected to the place where it had gone. Her love became something that hurt the things it touched. The creatures she claimed to love were preserved in ice, unchanging, unable to grow or move or become anything beyond what her love had frozen them into. The game handled this with a directness that surprised many players. The villain of Sun and Moon was a mother whose love for a child had gone wrong in a specific and recognizable way. Not wrong because it was too much, but wrong because it had been given no outlet for its grief and had calcified into something that controlled rather than cared for. The Pokemon frozen in her hall were beautiful and terrible, suspended in something that looked like preservation, but was actually a kind of ending. The player's role in the story of those games was not simply to defeat the villain, but to help the children of that villain reach their parent and do what the parent could not do for herself, which was recognize that what she was doing was not love. The resolution required the children of the relationship to grow beyond what the parent could do. This is not a small thing to put in a Pokémon game. Xerneas, the life Pokémon of Generation 6, was based specifically on a stag from Norse mythology that ran through the branches of Yggdrasil, the world tree, eating from its leaves while a dragon gnawed at its roots below. The stag of the world tree was a creature of an impossible place, living in the space between worlds, fed by the same tree that sustained all of existence. Xerneas's design, a deer with bioluminescent antlers that could grant eternal life, drew from this mythology and connected it to the idea of a Pokémon that embodied life itself rather than any particular kind of creature. Veltal, the death Pokémon paired with Xerneas, drew from a different but equally dark mythological source. The enormous red and black avian creature, capable of absorbing the life force of everything around it, was partly inspired by a specific Norse figure and partly by the simple idea of a creature whose nature was destruction and absorption. When Yveltal's life ended, it would cocoon itself and wait, and when it emerged again, it would have restored its strength from the life energy it had absorbed. The cycle of life energy flowing into death energy and back into life was the same cycle that Xerneas and Yveltal enacted between them. One gave, the other took. Neither was the villain of this story. They were simply the two halves of a process. Zygarde, the third member of the Kalos legendary trio, embodied a different mythological function, order and balance. Its multiple forms, from a single cell to a core to its assembled Zygarde complete, represented the gathering of dispersed elements into a unified force capable of maintaining the equilibrium between life and death. The snake and dog-like creature, in its 50% form, covered in hexagonal cells, was a design built around the idea of a modular organism, something made of many parts that could separate and recombine. The lore of Zygarde existed almost entirely in the margins of the games that introduced it, expanded later in a different medium, and remained somewhat incomplete in the main series itself. The mystery of what Zygarde was fully capable of was part of its design. The Tapas of Alola, the guardian Pokémon of each island, drew from Polynesian mythology in ways that were less directly named but clearly present. The concept of a guardian spirit associated with a specific place, powerful and protective, but capable of violence when its territory or its people were threatened, is present in many Pacific traditions. Each tapu was associated with its island's ecosystem and was said to create a specific kind of terrain when it battled, a zone of power that transformed the battlefield and reflected its nature. The tapu were not just powerful creatures, they were the spiritual identity of the islands made physical. Solgaleo and Lunala, the legendary Pokémon of Sun and Moon respectively, were built on a mythology that the game developed specifically for Alola, the idea of a Pokémon that devoured the sun and a Pokémon that was the full moon made living. The concept of the sun as something that could be consumed, that could be swallowed and then rise again when the creature that consumed it decided to release it, is an ancient one with roots in multiple mythological traditions. The game placed these ancient ideas into the context of ultra wormholes and interdimensional travel, connecting the mythological to the scientific without erasing either. The hidden truth about the legendary Pokémon inspired by celestial bodies is that they encode a relationship between astronomy and mythology that is genuinely ancient. Human beings have been looking at the sun and the moon and the stars and making stories about them for as long as there have been human beings. Pokémon drew from this tradition without reducing it to any single culture's version of it, creating creatures that felt both specific enough to be meaningful and general enough to feel like they belonged to an understanding that predated any particular tradition. The hidden power mechanic, present in the games from Gold and Silver through Sun and Moon, was a move that changed its type depending on the Pokemon's individual values. Individual values, or IVs, were the hidden statistics that the game assigned to each Pokemon when it was generated, numbers that the player could not directly observe without tools that were not available in the early games. Hidden Power's type calculation used these invisible numbers to produce a move whose type was literally determined by something the player could not see. The mechanic meant that two copies of the same Pokemon could have hidden power moves of different types, making the move's actual effect a hidden variable that required either external calculation tools or in-game testing to determine. The name Hidden Power was exactly right. It was power whose nature was hidden, accessible only through indirect means, revealing something about the Pokemon that its surface statistics did not show. The individual value system itself, fully visible now through mechanics introduced in later generations, was hidden from most of its history. Players felt its effects, noticing that two Pokemon of the same species with the same level could sometimes perform differently without being able to identify exactly why. The difference was in numbers they could not see, assigned at the moment the Pokemon came into existence and fixed thereafter. What a Pokemon was capable of was determined in part by something invisible, something it was born with, something it could not change. This is both a mechanical detail and a philosophical one. The question of what determines a creature's ultimate potential and whether that potential is fixed or malleable is one that runs through the entire series. IVs say that some of it is fixed, assigned before the journey begins. EVOs, effort values accumulated through battle, say that some of it is developed through experience. Friendship says that some of it depends on the quality of the relationship. Nature says that some of it comes from a disposition, a tendency that shapes how the creature grows. The interplay of all these systems creates something that is not simple and is not a single answer. The Eevee system, visible now in the Super Training and Poképelago and Pokejobs systems of later generations, was originally entirely invisible. Players who had not read about the mechanics externally simply did not know that the Pokemon they were training was accumulating a resource through battles that would eventually affect its final statistics. The invisible resource was being spent. The potential was being shaped. And unless you knew to look for this, you would not know it was happening until you compared your Pokemon to someone else's and found that the numbers did not match in the ways you expected. The hidden architecture of Pokemon's statistical systems is one of the most complex in all of gaming. It exists in layers, some visible and some not, some alterable and some fixed, some determined by the player's choices, and some determined before the player ever encounters the Pokemon. The resulting system is one in which every Pokemon, even two specimens of the same species at the same level, is genuinely unique, built from a specific combination of factors that will never be exactly replicated. This uniqueness is one of the series' quiet achievements. In a world where millions of players each have a Pikachu, no two of those Pikachus are identical. Each carries its own combination of individual values, its own accumulated effort values, its own friendship level, its own memories of battles and routes and moments that only its particular trainer has shared with it. The creature that feels generic because every player has one is actually specific because each one has been shaped by its own particular history. Mount Silver in Johto was one of the earliest examples of a location that existed primarily for the weight of what it contained rather than for any specific narrative purpose. After the player had completed the game, defeated the Elite Four, explored both Kanto and Johto, and found Red at the summit of Mount Silver, there were no words. Red, the protagonist of the first generation games, stood at the highest point in the region, and said nothing. The battle that followed was the hardest in the game, against a trainer whose Pokémon were all at extraordinarily high levels, a trainer who represented the culmination of everything the first generation games had been. The absence of dialogue was the most important design choice. Red had been there at the top of the mountain, waiting, and when found, he said nothing because there was nothing to say that the battle itself could not say more completely. The fight was the conversation, the outcome was the conclusion, and after it was over, the player stood in the same silence that Red had been standing in all along. Mount Silver's summit, accessible only to trainers who had done everything else, was a place outside the ordinary story of the game. It was not on any route. It did not lead anywhere. It simply existed as a destination for people who had come far enough to reach it, and at its peak was the encounter that represented the end of something much larger than a single game. The secret of Mount Silver was that it was the place where two generations of Pokémon stories met, and the meeting required no words. The distortion world of Pokémon Platinum, mentioned earlier for its inverted physics, also deserves consideration for what it represented narratively. The distortion world was not accessible at any point in the ordinary game. It became accessible only at the moment when the villain's plan succeeded well enough that reality began to break. The entry into the distortion world was not an achievement of the players, but a consequence of the situation having become extreme enough that the ordinary world could no longer contain what was happening. Walking through the distortion world, with its floating platforms and its reversed gravity and its complete absence of the landmarks that the ordinary world uses to orient itself, was an experience of genuine disorientation. The game was telling you something about the nature of extremity. When things go badly enough, the ordinary frameworks stop working. You cannot navigate by the rules that serve you in normal circumstances because you are not in normal circumstances. You have to find a new way to move through a space that does not behave the way you expect. The ruins of the legendary titans in Hoenn, the chambers of Regirock, Regis, and Registeel were designed with a specific silence that felt ancient rather than empty. The chamber of each Regi was a room with no decoration except the dots on the wall that corresponded to the Regi's face and the braille inscription on the wall that you had to read and understand in order to open the inner chamber. The silence was not oppressive. It was attentive. It was the silence of a place that had been waiting for someone to arrive and do the specific thing required to proceed. The requirement to read braille created a moment in which the game demanded that the player leave the game entirely, find external information, and return with knowledge they had obtained through genuine effort. This was asking something real of the player, the willingness to seek information outside the world being played. The reward was not just the Pokémon itself, but the experience of having genuinely solved something, of having been given a lock in an ancient language and found the key. The post-game of Heart Gold and Soul Silver, the remakes of Gold and Silver, was the most expansive in the series. After defeating the Elite Four, the player gained access to Kanto, an entirely separate region that required re-earning gym badges and eventually culminating in the encounter on Mount Silver. The sense that completing one game's story revealed an entirely new story, equally complete in itself, was a structural achievement that subsequent games have referenced but rarely matched. The post-game of Black 2 and White 2, the direct sequels to Black and White, took a different approach. These were genuinely new games, set 2 years after the events of the originals, in a Unova changed by the passage of time. Characters had grown, locations had changed, the world had moved on from what the player of the original games had experienced. The hidden content here was not a new region, but a new relationship with time, the discovery that the world continued without you, that it had its own momentum, that returning after an absence would find things different from what you left. The Delta episode of Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire was perhaps the most dramatically scaled post-game content in the series, involving an asteroid threat to the entire world and the descent into ultraspace to find Rayquaza and persuade it to destroy the asteroid. The stakes were genuinely enormous, and the episode handled them with a specificity that the main game's more measured pace could not afford. The post-game revealed that the world had come closer to ending than the main story had suggested, and that the ending had been averted by the specific combination of circumstances that the player and their partner had created. The Crown Tundra DLC for Sword and Shield sent players into a snowy landscape full of legendary Pokémon from every previous generation, living in a place that connected to the mythology of the entire series. The Dynamax adventures that formed the heart of the experience placed players in cooperation with others to reach sleeping legendary Pokémon at the end of extended dungeon runs. The content was an acknowledgement of the series' full history, a space in which creatures from every previous generation existed and could be found and understood as part of the same continuing world, rather than as relics of separate eras. The post-game of Pokémon Legends. Arceus, after the main story concluded, revealed the true nature of the mystery that the game had been building toward. The identity of the being that had summoned the player to Hisui in the first place. The revelation was one of the most audacious narrative moves the series had attempted, and it worked precisely because the game had spent its entire runtime carefully establishing the mythology that the revelation drew on. The hidden thing at the center of that game was hiding in plain sight from the beginning, visible to anyone who had played enough other games to recognize what the clues were pointing toward. The type, Null, and Silvally line was created within the story of the games that introduced it as an artificial Pokémon designed to take on any type, made from the genetic material of multiple Pokémon and controlled by a mask that suppressed its power. The creature's creation echoed the creation of Mewtwo, and Gladion, the character who had freed type Null from captivity and traveled with it until it trusted him enough to evolve, was a figure whose arc mirrored the theme of what genuine relationship could accomplish. When type Null evolved into Silvally, the mask fell away. The power that the mask had contained was not destructive when it was accompanied by trust. What looked like something that needed to be controlled was actually something that had simply not yet encountered a relationship strong enough to make control unnecessary. Silvally's memory disks, which allowed it to change type in battle, were the functional expression of what it had been designed to do, but they only became available after the relationship was genuine enough that the creature could be trusted with its own power. The RKS system that gave Silvally its type-changing ability was described in the Pokédex as allowing it to change the composition of its cells to match any type. This biological flexibility, built into a creature that was itself built from the components of many other creatures, made Silvally a kind of living type chart, capable of becoming anything it needed to be in a given moment. This was what the scientists who created it had intended, but the creature they made became something more than they intended, something whose capacity for relationship transformed what its designed function could actually mean. The Cosmog and Solgaleo/Lunala line revealed a different kind of hidden connection, the connection between the ordinary world and the space beyond it. Cosmog was found in an unusual state, a tiny nebula Pokémon far from its natural environment, cared for by a character who was not from the world of the game at all. The Pokémon's evolution into Cosmoem and then into a legendary creature capable of opening portals between dimensions happened in the context of a story about belonging and home, and the question of where a creature who can exist anywhere actually belongs. The answer the games offered was not simple. Lunala and Solgaleo were shown to have a home in ultraspace, the realm beyond the wormholes, and also a connection to the world they had entered through those wormholes. They belonged to both. The connection was not an either or. It was a both, and the both was important because the game was making a gentle argument about the possibility of belonging to more than one place without being diminished by either. The Pokémon world has always understood that attention is a form of care, that noticing something carefully is a way of acknowledging its value. Every Pokémon in the Pokédex, from the most powerful legendary to the most common route encounter, has been given a name and a type and at least 2 entries that describe something about its life and behavior. None of them have been left undescribed, unnamed, unacknowledged. The most overlooked creature in the game has still been looked at, still been thought about, still been given a place in the world's record. Every creature was noticed. Every creature was named. Every creature was given its space in the catalog of living things. This is not a small commitment. Over 1,000 creatures, each requiring a design, a name, a type assignment, a stat distribution, a set of moves it could learn, a location where it could be found, 2 Pokédex entries, a cry, an animation. The labor of attention involved in building the Pokémon world is extraordinary when considered in aggregate, and the result of that attention is a world that feels genuinely inhabited, genuinely detailed, genuinely worth the time it takes to move through carefully. The Pokémon world rewards patience, not as a game mechanic choice, but as a structural truth about how the world was built. The things you find when you slow down are not things that were hidden as obstacles to the impatient. They are things that were placed carefully for whoever would eventually slow down enough to find them, with the assumption that someone would, that the attention would eventually arrive, that the world would not have to wait forever to be seen. This patience on the part of the designers who place things knowing they might not be found for years is itself a form of trust, a trust that someone somewhere would eventually look, that the world being built was being built for real people who would bring real attention to it at some point along the way, that the carefully placed detail, the name chosen for its hidden meaning, the Pokédex entry that revealed something quietly heartbreaking, would eventually meet the player who would receive it fully. That trust is what makes the hidden secrets of Pokémon feel less like Easter eggs and more like correspondence. Letters from the people who built the world to the people who would live in it, sealed and left in places where they would be found by those who were looking for exactly this kind of message. A message that says, "We thought about this. We thought about you. We built this world as carefully as we could, and we put things in it that would only fully matter to someone who was paying attention, and we trusted that you would be that person." The response to that trust, across decades of players finding and sharing and discussing and debating these hidden things, is itself remarkable. The community of people who have spent their lives paying attention to the Pokémon world, who have decoded the Braille inscriptions and read the Pokédex entries and traced the connections between types and argued about what the intention behind each design element was, is a community built on the same impulse that built the world. The impulse to pay careful attention, to take things seriously, to believe that what seems small might be important. This is the deepest hidden secret of Pokémon, not a specific piece of information located in a specific game, but the fact of what the world has always been asking of the people who enter it: attention, patience, curiosity, care, the willingness to slow down enough to see what is actually there, the openness to being surprised by something familiar, the trust that looking carefully will reveal something worth finding. The Pokémon world asks these things quietly, without insistence, in the same way that the best places in the real world ask you to slow down and notice them. And for those who accept the invitation, for those who slow down and look and listen and read and wonder, the world reveals itself as having been waiting for exactly this, ready to show you what it has been keeping all along, not as a secret guarded against discovery, but as a gift prepared for someone who would know how to receive it. The colors of the adventure stretch from white to black, from beginning to completion, through every shade of experience that lies between, and the journey is never entirely over because the world is never entirely known, and somewhere in the tall grass or the deep ocean or the frozen mountain peak or the ancient ruins that predate every civilization currently visible, there is something that has not yet been found, that is waiting with the particular patience of things that know they will eventually be found because they were placed by people who trusted that someone would eventually look. The way the Pokémon world has handled the passage of time between games is one of its most under-examined narrative achievements. The world does not reset between generations. It moves. Events that happened in earlier games are referenced in later ones. Characters age, places change, and the sense that this is a single continuous world rather than a series of fresh starts accumulates quietly over the years. Red and blue establish the world. Gold and silver returned to it 3 years later. The world had moved on. The player's mother gave the player a phone number. Gym leaders had changed their teams. The rocket organization had disbanded but was reorganizing in the mountains. Time had passed in the world, even while it stood still in the game files. This temporal continuity was a statement. The world you visit is not a snapshot. It is an ongoing thing. The question of where the player characters of previous games go after their stories end is one that the series has handled with a kind of elegant vagueness. Red is on the mountain. Ethan and Lyra are somewhere in Johto. Brennan and May are somewhere in Hoenn. Lucas and Dawn are somewhere in Sinnoh. They exist in the worlds, presumably, living lives that the games do not depict, having completed the arcs that the player shared with them, and then continuing into a future that belongs only to them. This is actually how all protagonists exist after their stories end. The story is over, but the living continues. The Pokémon games are unusual in occasionally glimpsing these continuing lives, in letting you see the protagonist of a previous game standing somewhere, still existing, still the person they became during the adventure you shared. Red on Mount Silver is the most famous example, and it is the most powerful because it says nothing. It does not explain where Red has been or what he has been doing. It shows him where he ended up, at the highest point of everything, and lets you draw your own conclusions. The characters who exist between games, who appear in one title and are referenced in another, create a network of connection that rewards players who have experienced multiple parts of the franchise. Cynthia, the Sinnoh champion, appears in Unova and Alola and multiple other contexts, always recognizably herself, always carrying the specific quality that her original appearance established. The acknowledgement that the world is connected enough for someone to travel from Sinnoh to Unova and be recognized there creates a sense of geographic coherence that the games rarely make explicit but always imply. The Looker character, who appears across multiple generations as a member of an international police organization, is one of the most significant examples of cross-generational continuity in the series. His presence in Sinnoh, Unova, Kalos, and Alola, always recognizably the same person, always pursuing a specific kind of mission, always finding himself connected to the player's journey in ways that he did not expect, creates a thread that runs through multiple games without requiring that the player know all of them to appreciate any individual appearance. He is more interesting when you know his full history, but he is functional and engaging in each individual context. The hidden history of the Pokémon world, the events that happened before the games began, that shaped the civilizations that left the ruins you walk through, is one of the most consistently interesting things about the franchise. The games drop hints about this history through Pokédex entries and environmental details, and the occasional NPC who says something that implies a longer story than the current one. But they rarely tell it directly, because the indirect approach is more truthful to how ancient history actually works. We do not know the full story of the civilization that built the ruins in any actual archaeological site. We have the artifacts, the buildings, the objects, the marks left on stone, and we have interpretations of what those marks might mean. The Pokémon world handles its ancient history the same way, giving you the evidence and trusting you to form your own interpretations, understanding that the interpretations that feel most true to different people will be different, and that this multiplicity is actually more faithful to the nature of the past than a single authoritative account. The cry of a Pokémon is one of the most immediately recognizable things about each creature. In the original games, these cries were synthesized sounds built from a small set of base samples modified through pitch and duration and envelope to create something specific to each species. Some cries were immediately recognizable as related to the sounds of real animals. Others were entirely abstract, belonging to no real-world referent, but sounding exactly right for the creature making them. Charizard's cry has a roughness to it, a low bellow that suggests both power and the specific resonance of a large chest cavity filled with fire. Mewtwo's cry is more complex, something with several layers that suggests a consciousness behind it, something thinking rather than simply vocalizing. Jigglypuff's cry is a shorter, rounder sound that matches the creature's design, soft, curved, contained. Later games allowed for more complex sounds, and the cries of Pokémon became more elaborate as the hardware improved. But the original cries, created from almost nothing, are still the ones that most strongly trigger the specific recognition that comes from having heard them during formative years. The sound is the creature in a way that goes beyond visual recognition. You can hear a Pokémon before you see it, and the hearing tells you what is coming. The ambient sounds of the Pokémon world, the birds and insects that could sometimes be heard in routes with specific weather conditions or times of day, the sound of water moving in routes that passed rivers or the sea, the wind that could be heard on high mountain paths. These are details that players who played with the sound on noticed without always naming. They created an environmental texture that made the world feel inhabited by things beyond what the sprite-based graphics could depict. The Pokémon cries that change slightly during a cry command are one of the subtler details of creature design. When a Pokémon enters battle, its cry plays at full pitch. As it takes damage, some games altered the playback of the cry to suggest distress or weakening. The creature was the same. The sound it made was different, and the difference communicated something about its state that the health bar alone could not fully convey. The specific soundscape of the Lavender Tower in red and blue, with its particular music and the ghost encounters, and the sense of a place where many things had ended, created an audio experience that players carried forward into every subsequent encounter with ghost-type Pokémon. The sound of that location shaped the emotional resonance of an entire type category for a generation of players. The music said, "Here, the rules are different. Here, the things you are comfortable with do not fully apply. Here, something else is present." The Pokéflute, an item that woke sleeping Pokémon and was required to proceed past Snorlax on the path between Lavender and Celadon, was one of the most celebrated items in the original games for the way it combined utility with a specific sound. The flute's melody, brief and distinctive, was built into the game as a single specific moment rather than a general mechanic. You used it on Snorlax, the Snorlax woke up, and the sound of the flute remained associated with that specific encounter and that specific awakening, rather than becoming a generic tool for general use. The Pokémon world is simultaneously very small and very large. It is small in the sense that the player character can cross a region in a few days of in-game time, can see across entire routes from one endpoint to the other, can reach legendary Pokémon at the peaks of mountains with an hour's walk from the nearest city. But it is large in the sense that the lore it contains seems to extend in all directions without apparent limit, that the history goes back millions of years, that the geography implies an entire planet, of which the player sees only a small portion. The first glimpse of this scale is usually the moment when a player first receives HM Surf and realizes that the blue that fills the space beyond the roots is not simply decorative, but traversable. The ocean existed before you could cross it. The game waited patiently while you developed the capacity to enter it. And when you finally did, the roots that had seemed like the whole of the world revealed themselves to be small islands of accessible land in a much larger context. Routes 19A20 and 21 in Kanto, the open water routes south of Fuchsia City, were some of the longest routes in the game in terms of travel time. They were almost entirely water, crossed by trainers on Pokémon that could surf, punctuated by small islands with grass patches. The sense of crossing something genuinely large, of being in the middle of something that had no visible edges, was one of the earliest experiences the games provided of scale that exceeded what the root system typically implied. The Great Martian Sinnoh, accessed through a binocular system that allowed players to preview what Pokémon might be found inside before entering, was a single large environment with multiple small areas that each had their own encounter tables. The sense that the marsh was a place with different zones, each with its own inhabitants, created a miniature version of the ecosystem design that the games applied at the regional level. The marsh was a world within the world, and understanding it required the same kind of patient attention that understanding the larger world required. The wild area of Sword and Shield, which was explicitly described as an open-world section within what was otherwise a more traditionally structured game, attempted to provide a sense of a world that existed at a different scale than the roots. You could see Pokémon moving through it before engaging them. The weather changed in real time. Different Pokémon appeared in different weather conditions, and strong Pokémon that were too high a level to catch yet existed visibly in the world, displaying themselves but remaining out of reach until the player's badges allowed the game to release them into the catchable pool. The wild area was an early gesture toward the kind of full open world that Pokémon Legends, Arceus, and Pokémon Scarlet and Violet eventually pursued more completely. The freedom to move through an environment without the structure of routes, to encounter creatures based on the logic of the ecosystem rather than the logic of a predetermined path, to approach a destination from multiple angles rather than a single prescribed direction. These are experiences that change what the world feels like in a fundamental way. In an open world, you are in the world. In a routed world, you are on a path that passes through the world. Both have their particular pleasures and their particular truths. The rooted world is more legible, more controlled, more able to build specific experiences at specific moments. The open world is more continuous, more responsive, more able to create the sense that you are a small thing in a large space that has its own rules. The Pokémon series has spent its recent history exploring both and finding ways to combine them, which is itself a kind of evolution in how the world wants to be understood. The way the games use color to communicate without words is one of these truths. The progression from the relatively muted palettes of the earlier games, limited by hardware, to the rich full color of the later ones, is not just a technical evolution, but a shift in the kind of emotional information that color can carry. The blues of water roots in the three-dimensional games are genuinely beautiful in a way that blue pixels on a small screen could only suggest. The greens of forests in Kalos were specific enough to feel like they belonged to a particular place, rather than a generic environment. The warm ochre and amber of the Alolan landscape carried a heat that the earlier games could not physically provide. The seasonal color palettes of Unova were perhaps the most carefully considered. Winter's white and gray carried a genuine hush, a sense that the world had become quieter and stiller and harder to navigate. Summer's full saturation, with greens pushed toward their most vivid expression, felt specifically like the height of a growing season, the moment when everything that was going to grow had grown. Autumn's amber and red created a beautiful ambiguity between harvest and ending, between fulfillment and the approach of dormancy. These were not incidental aesthetic choices. They were seasonal arguments about what the world looked like when it was being fully itself. The color of legendary Pokémon is often more specific than it might appear. Rayquaza's deep green, distinct from the brighter greens of other dragon types, belongs to something that exists at high altitude, where the light is different and the air is thinner, and the color of living things carries a quality not seen at ground level. Kyogre's deep blue is the blue of very deep water, not the lighter blue of shallow coastal regions. Gruden's red is the red of magma, not the red of fire, older, denser, belonging to something beneath the surface rather than something that burns above it. These are specific colors chosen for what they communicate about where these creatures live and what they are. The hidden architecture of color in the Pokémon world is something that rewards slow looking in the same way that the hidden architecture of everything else in the world rewards slow looking. The world was built carefully. The choices were made with intention. The things that seem like they might have just been picked are usually the things that were picked with the most deliberation. Playing Pokémon Blue as a child and playing it again as an adult are two different experiences of the same game. The child plays forward through the story toward the becoming. The adult plays through everything else, the things they notice now that they did not have the framework to notice before, the design choices that only become legible when you have spent time thinking about what design actually does, the emotional texture of a world built for children by adults who took the task seriously enough to put real things into it. The Pokémon Tower in Lavender Town means something different when you have lost something. The Marowak who cannot leave means something different when you understand what grief can do to the structure of time, how it can make the past feel more present than the present, how the place where something ended can become a place that a part of you never leaves. The old man in Viridian City who shows you how to catch a Pokémon before you begin your journey and who requires only that you have had breakfast means something different when you understand that every teacher who gives you something useful was once a young person who did not yet know how to teach. The games that were made for children have always contained things that were waiting for the children to grow up, not in a way that excludes children from the full experience of the games, but in a way that adds layers as the player's understanding deepens. The surface is always accessible and always sufficient. The depth rewards those who return, who play again from a different place in their lives, who bring the accumulated understanding of years to a world they thought they already knew. The thing that the Pokémon world understands about secrets is that the best ones are not kept from you. They are kept for you. There is a difference between hiding something so that it cannot be found and placing something in a location where only the right kind of attention will find it. The first is exclusion. The second is an invitation with specific requirements, and the requirement is simply that you be the kind of person who looks carefully at the world around them and finds it worth looking at carefully. The designers of the Pokémon world have always been the kind of people who look carefully. Their games are evidence of an approach to creative work in which nothing is too small to matter, nothing is so incidental that it does not deserve thought. The color of a legendary Pokémon's scales, chosen for what it communicates about the altitude at which the creature lives. The specific berry that causes a Phabis to grow in beauty toward the evolution that was always waiting for it. The braille inscription on the wall of an underwater chamber, placed there by people who expected that someone would eventually take the time to learn to read it. the name of a town that in the right language completes a pattern that runs across two entire regions in two separate games. These things were not accidental. They were not the random byproducts of a creative process that sometimes produces interesting side effects. They were placed deliberately with the specific knowledge that most players would never find them, and with the specific hope that some players would, and that those players would feel exactly what you feel when you find something that was prepared for you in advance by someone who understood what you would need when you arrived. That feeling is not an accident either. It is one of the oldest pleasures that storytelling can provide. The feeling of being understood by something that could not have known you were coming. The hidden secret that turns out to have been waiting specifically for your particular quality of attention. The detail that only makes sense when combined with something you know, something from your own experience or your own careful reading of the world you have been moving through. The convergence of the world's preparation and your readiness, meeting in a moment that feels like discovery, but is actually recognition. The world prepared this, and you were ready to receive it, and the two of you have finally arrived at the same place. Jirachi, the wish granter who sleeps for 1,000 years and wakes for only 7 days, is described as having the power to grant any wish. But the grants are not described in the Pokédex as reliable or as coming without complication. Jirachi simply has the power. What it does with that power and what those who seek it do with the wishes it grants is left to the story and the imagination. The creature capable of granting wishes is a creature that asks what you would wish for. That question, without Jirachi present, without any Pokémon present, is itself one of the deepest questions the world can pose. Celebi, who moves through time freely, carries every visit to every moment as an equal present. For Celebi, there is no past and no future, only an infinite now that happens to be accessible from every point in linear time. The forests it inhabits are described as thriving, as being unusually full of life, because something that exists in every moment of a place's history brings with it not all the health and vitality of every season that place has ever experienced. The presence of timelessness feeds what exists in time. The presence of the eternal nourishes the temporary. Shaman, in its land form, is a small hedgehog Pokémon covered in flowers, described as living in flower fields and cleaning polluted air by absorbing toxins into the flowers that grow from its body. The transformation of environmental harm into blossoming life is one of the most hopeful design concepts in the series. A creature that takes what is harmful and converts it into what is beautiful, that exists at the intersection of the damaged and the repaired, that carries in its small body the specific capacity to make the air breathable again. This is a meaningful thing to place in a world that acknowledges environmental harm as a real force. Shaman's sky form, reached through exposure to a specific flower, is something entirely different. Fast, fierce, capable of flight, no longer small and gentle but sharp and aerial and quick. The transformation is temporary. The flower's effect fades, and Shaman returns to its land form. The capacity for something to become briefly very different from what it ordinarily is, and then to return to itself, is a pattern the Pokémon world has explored through many different creatures in many different ways. What you ordinarily are is not all you are capable of, and returning to what you ordinarily are after a moment of being something else is not a loss. It is simply the completion of a cycle that was always temporary and always worth experiencing. The hidden secrets of the Pokémon world are, in the end, made of exactly these materials: small, careful details, patient design, the deliberate placement of meaning in places where attention will eventually find it. The world was built to be worth looking at. The looking reveals what the world was always ready to show, and the showing is the gift that the builders of the world prepared for everyone who would eventually arrive here in this quiet moment, ready to receive it. The Pokémon world was always a world made of hidden things, of secrets that were not kept from anyone, but simply waiting for the right moment to be found. The moment is always now. The finder is always you, and the world is always ready, patient, and full, and quietly extraordinary to offer what it has been holding in trust for exactly this kind of careful, unhurried attention. The tall grass is still rustling. The music still knows what is needed. The first steps of any adventure begin in the same quiet room, with the same open window, with the same world waiting just beyond the door, full of things worth finding, full of things that were always worth finding, full of everything that the people who built this world believed was worth hating carefully for the person who would eventually look. The secrets are still there, in every version of this world that has ever been played, in every adventure that has ever begun in a small room with a window looking out on everything that is about to begin. They are still there. They have always been there, and they are yours. They belong to whoever slows down long enough to find them, and tonight you are that person. Thanks for watching. If these quiet details helped you relax, there's another video waiting on the left of your screen. You can let it play as you close your eyes. You might hear something soothing before you fall asleep again.